She was 22 years old. She had $11 in her pocket, a letter from a man she had never met, and a wagon train on fire behind her. What she did not know as she ran through the smoke that September afternoon was that the man waiting for her on the mountain was not one man. He was three, and somewhere down in Willow Creek, a man with a sickle scar on his cheek had already decided she would not live long enough to meet any of them. Let me tell you what happened next. The letter in her coat pocket had promised her a home in Idaho. The letter had not said she would have to crawl through ash to reach it. The letter had not said the man she was meant to marry was not one man but three. And the letter most certainly had not said that somewhere down in Willow Creek, a man with gray hair cut like a sickle and a gold ring too big for his finger had already decided she would not be allowed to live long enough to meet him. Elizabeth Hartwell could not see her own hands. The smoke was so thick she could not tell up from down. Somewhere behind her, Mary Patterson was screaming her name. Somewhere ahead, a horse shrieked once and went silent. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and she could not say if it was blood or fear, or simply the dry, coppery taste of a world that had turned to fire in the span of a single breath. She clutched the cameo brooch at her throat. Her mother's brooch, the last thing of value she owned in this world. The metal had grown warm against her collarbone, and somewhere in the back of her mind she understood that warmth meant the fire was closer than she could see, and yet she could not make her feet stop running. She ran toward what she believed was freedom. She was wrong. She was running straight into hell. Before this story goes any further, friend, if you find yourself drawn to tales of the old American frontier, the kind of tale your grandfather might have told you on a cold porch in autumn, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And while you are at it, leave a comment below. Tell me what state you are listening from tonight. I read every single one. Now then, let us return to Elizabeth and to the fire and to the three men who did not yet know she was about to fall into their lives like an answered prayer. To understand how Elizabeth Hartwell came to be running through that smoke, you have to understand how she had nothing left to run toward. She was 22 years old. She had been an orphan since she was 16. Her father had been a printer in a small shop on Beacon Street in Boston, a kind man who smelled of ink and pipe tobacco, and who had died slowly of consumption, coughing into a handkerchief by the window, watching the snow fall on a world he was leaving. Her mother had died 4 years before that, bringing a stillborn son into a cold December room, holding Elizabeth's hand at the end and saying, "Do not be afraid, my girl. The Lord has counted every hair on your head." After her father's funeral, Elizabeth went to work as a governess for the Whitmore family on Commonwealth Avenue. The Whitmores had old Boston money and new Boston pride, and they paid her $7 a week to teach their three children French piano and the proper way to hold a teacup. For 6 years, she lived in a narrow servant's room above the kitchen. For 6 years, she saved every penny she could and kept her head down and asked nothing of the world but to be left alone with her books and her quiet. And then Charles Whitmore came home from Yale. Charles was 19, the eldest son, all loose collars and bourbon breath, and the easy cruelty of a young man who had never been told no. He started looking at Elizabeth at the breakfast table. He started lingering in the hallways outside her room. She kept the door locked. She kept her eyes down. She prayed. One night in July, he came home drunk from a club on Tremont Street and tried the door. When he found it locked, he kicked it in. He was bigger than she was. He was stronger than she was. But Elizabeth Hartwell had grown up the daughter of a printer who taught her that a woman's life was her own. And when Charles Whitmore put his hand on her arm, she shoved him backward with every ounce of strength she had. He stumbled. He struck his head on the corner of her writing desk. He fell to the floor and bled into the rag rug she had braided herself the winter before. He did not die. He woke up an hour later and stumbled back to his own room, holding the back of his head and cursing her name. But by sunrise, the story had already been written. Mildred Whitmore stood in Elizabeth's doorway at 6 o'clock the next morning, with her arms folded across her gray silk wrapper. Her face was carved from the same stone as the steps of the Boston Athenaeum, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had never lost an argument in her life. "You are a temptress," she said. "You have ruined my son. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings. There will be no letter of reference. There will be no final wages. And if I hear you have spoken a single word against this family in any parlor in Boston, I will make certain you do not find honest work in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts." Elizabeth packed her trunk in 40 minutes. She walked out the servant's entrance with $11.47. To her name, the cameo brooch, her mother had left her a Bible with the family record written in her father's neat printer's hand and a wooden comb. The morning was bright. The cobblestones were already warm. She walked 3 blocks before she let herself cry, and even then she did it standing up against a brick wall, the way a woman cries when she has nowhere to sit down. For a week, she lived in a boarding house on Washington Street that smelled of cabbage and unwashed sheets. She answered 4 advertisements for governess positions and was turned away from each one. The world had its own quiet ways of communicating. She understood. The Whitmores had spoken. It was in a coffee house on the 7th day with $3 left and her stomach tight from skipping breakfast that she opened a folded copy of the Matrimonial Times. The advertisements were small and earnest, and a little sad men in territories she had never heard of asking for wives the way other men asked for tools. She read them all twice, and then she found one. Sawtooth Ridge, Idaho territory. Mountain homesteader requires wife. Hard country, fair man, will pay passage. Reply C. Calloway through the general store, Willow Creek. She wrote her reply that afternoon. She wrote in her best hand the hand her father had taught her, looped and steady and unafraid. She told the man she was 22. She told him she had no family. She told him she could read and write and cook plain food and mend clothes, and that she did not faint at the sight of blood. She did not tell him about Charles Whitmore. She did not tell him about Mildred. She told him only that she had been a governess and that she was at present between situations. 2 weeks later, a letter came back. The hand was beautiful, strong, even slightly slanted to the right. She would learn later that the man who wrote it had taught himself to write at a kitchen table in 1859, by candlelight copying out the Book of Psalms 1 verse a night for 2 years. The letter was short. "Miss Hartwell, my name is Caleb Calloway. I am 34 years old, a blacksmith by trade. I live on a mountain with my family. The land is good. The house is sound. I cannot promise you wealth, but I can promise you a warm roof and a man who will not raise his hand against you, not in this life. Stagecoach fare and rail ticket are enclosed. I will look for you in September. C. Calloway." Inside the envelope were a railway ticket from Boston to Cheyenne and a stagecoach voucher from Cheyenne to Willow Creek. The fare alone was $47. He had sent it to a woman he had never met. Elizabeth read the letter 4 times that night. Then she folded it into her Bible and slept for the first time in 2 weeks without waking before dawn. She sold the small gold ring her mother had once worn on a chain, the wedding band of a printer's wife. She kept the cameo. She sewed $50 into the lining of her petticoat, and she boarded the train going west. The wagon train left Cheyenne on the 1st of September. There were 12 wagons, 18 men, 11 women, and 9 children. The trail boss was a one-legged Union veteran named Frank Boudreau, who chewed tobacco and prayed in French, and who told them all on the first night, gathered around a fire of buffalo chips and dry sage, that the autumn had been the driest he had seen in 20 years on the trail. "The grass is brittle," he told them, holding up a blade he had pulled from the ground. "It snaps like glass. One spark, one careless cigar, one cook fire intended for half a minute, and you will see hell come up out of the earth. So I am telling you now, and I will not tell you again. No tobacco when we are stopped. No fires outside the cleared circles. If I see a man light a pipe in the grass, I will take that pipe from him and I will break it on his own knee. Are we clear?" They were clear. It was on the second night of the trail that Elizabeth met Mary Patterson. Mary was 28, 8 months pregnant, and so radiant with the late stage of her carrying that she seemed almost lit from inside. Her husband Thomas was a kind, quiet man with a thick beard who walked beside the wagon by day and rubbed his wife's swollen ankles by firelight. They had no other children yet, but Mary spoke of the one inside her the way a woman speaks of an old friend. She is a girl, Mary told Elizabeth on the third night, both of them sitting on a folded canvas watching the stars come out one by one over the plains. I know it. I have known it since the second month. Tom thinks I am being foolish. But a mother knows. Elizabeth liked her immediately. They walked together by day. They shared bread and dried beef and stories. When Mary learned that Elizabeth was a mail-order bride, she did not laugh or pity her. She only smiled. I came to Tom the same way Mary said. From Philadelphia in 1873. I cried every night for the first month of the trail. I thought I had ruined my life. And then I met him at the depot in Cheyenne, and he had brought me a small bouquet of wildflowers, and I knew. You will know too, Elizabeth. In the first week you will know. If he is a good man, you will know. There was an older trader on the wagon train, a man with gray whiskers and shrewd eyes named Ezra Holcomb. He had been hauling goods through the territories for 30 years. On the fourth night, when Elizabeth told him she was bound for the Callaway homestead at Sawtooth Ridge, his face did something strange. Not fear, not quite, but a kind of careful narrowing the way a man's face changes when he hears the name of a thing he has tried to forget. Callaway, he said slowly. The three brothers up on Sawtooth. You know them, Elizabeth said. I know of them. Quiet men, honest by all accounts. The eldest is a fine smith. People bring their plows up from 60 miles away. He paused. He looked into the fire. Then he looked at her. But you mind yourself when you get to Willow Creek, miss. There is a man down there in the mayor's chair, a man named Blackwood, who has had his eye on Sawtooth Ridge land for some years now. There have been accidents on that mountain. Hunters who fell, trappers who froze. Land that changed hands cheap because a widow could not afford to fight in court. Whatever business you have with the Callaways, you keep it close to your chest in town. Some folks in Willow Creek are friends to Blackwood, and Blackwood is no friend to anyone but himself. He spat tobacco juice into the fire and would say no more. Elizabeth lay awake that night under the wagon looking up at the stars. She thought of the letter in her trunk. She thought of the man she had never met. She wondered what she was walking into. She did not yet know that the answer to that question would not arrive in Willow Creek. The answer was already on its way to meet her in the form of a careless pipe, a dry south wind, and a single unlucky spark. The fifth day broke clear and hot and entirely too still. Frank Boudreau read the sky at dawn the way a sailor reads water. He frowned. He kept frowning. By noon, when the wagon stopped to rest the teams in a wide grassy bowl with the Sawtooth Peaks, a thin blue line on the northern horizon, he was frowning so hard he had cut twin grooves between his brows. The wind is wrong, he said to no one in particular. The wind is wrong. Tom Patterson was tired. His wife was 8 months heavy. He had walked 12 miles that morning leading the team. He did not mean to do what he did. He simply forgot. He climbed down from the wagon, sat on the wagon tongue, took out his briar pipe, struck a match against his boot, and lit a small, comforting bowl of tobacco. He drew once. The match still burned in his hand. The wind that had been still all morning lifted suddenly out of the south, a hot, dry hand of air that came up from the floor of the bowl and lifted the burning match clean out of his fingers. The match landed in the grass 8 feet away. Tom saw it land. He stood up. He took 2 running steps toward it. The grass took the flame the way dry paper takes a flame, not in a slow gathering. In an instant, a wide, pale fan of fire bloomed across 30 feet of ground in the time it took him to draw a single breath, and the wind came up harder behind it, and the fan became a wall. The wall reached the first wagon before any human voice had time to cry out. Elizabeth was sitting in the back of the 7th wagon reading the book of Ruth in her mother's Bible. She heard a man scream. She heard a woman scream the same word over and over, and the word was no, no, no. She looked up and saw the sky outside the canvas had turned the color of a copper kettle. She climbed out of the wagon. The bowl of grass was on fire from one ridge to the other. The lead wagons were already burning. Horses were rearing, breaking traces, plunging through the wall of flame and emerging on the other side with their manes on fire. Frank Boudreau was on his one leg and his crutch screaming orders that no one could hear. Mary Patterson was standing beside her wagon with both hands pressed to her swollen belly, her face a mask of terror, calling Elizabeth's name. Elizabeth jumped down from the wagon and the heat hit her like a thrown punch. The smoke poured down over the bowl in a hot gray tide. In 4 seconds, she could not see Mary. In 6 seconds, she could not see the wagon she had just climbed out of. She turned in a circle, and every direction was the same. Smoke, heat, the roaring of fire that did not sound like fire at all, but like a living animal, an enormous, low-throated thing eating the world. She ran. She did not know which way. She only knew that the heat was worse on her right side, so she turned her left shoulder forward and ran. She tripped over a saddle that lay smoking in the grass. The leather had gone soft as butter. She got up. She ran. She passed something that might have been a person on the ground, something she did not stop to look at, something she would dream of for the rest of her life. The smell of burning hair was in the air, and she could not say whose hair it was, and she did not stop. A small calf no bigger than a dog ran past her with its sides smoking and its eyes white and rolled. It was the loneliest thing she had ever seen. She ran for what she would later believe was an hour, but was probably 8 minutes. The grass thinned, the ground rose. She crossed a dry creek bed where the stones were already too hot to touch. She climbed a low ridge, and on the far side of it, the smoke thinned a little enough for her to see a few burned pines standing like black candles, and then the smoke closed in again, and she fell. She fell to her knees beside the trunk of one of the dead pines. Her hands were blistered. Her hair smelled of fire. The cameo brooch at her throat had warped in the heat. The small carved face of the woman on it slumped sideways like a stroke victim. She put her hands flat on the ash. The ash was warm. She closed her eyes. She thought of her mother. She thought of the printer's shop on Beacon Street and the way the morning sun used to come through the front window and lay a bar of gold across her father's apron. She thought of Mary Patterson and the unborn child and could not bear it, so she stopped thinking of them. Her mind, with the strange clarity of a person who is dying, settled at last on the man she was supposed to marry. The man she had never seen. C. Calloway. She did not know his face. She did not know his voice. She knew only the careful slant of his handwriting and the words he had written. A warm roof, a man who will not raise his hand. She was sorry she had not lived long enough to thank him for the ticket. She was sorry she had not lived long enough to learn what he looked like. She breathed in smoke. She thought, "I am sorry, Mother. I did not make it to Idaho. I am sorry." 4 miles to the north at the lip of the Sawtooth Ridge, a hammer rang on iron and stopped. The Calloway homestead sat on a shelf of rock 3,400 feet above the valley floor. It had been built by a Pennsylvania ironmonger named Joshua Calloway in the spring of 1869 and finished by his 3 identical sons in the autumn of the same year, 3 months before the elder Calloway and his wife were buried side by side under the lone pine on the eastern ridge. The cabin was 28 feet by 16, made of squared lodgepole pine logs notched at the corners and chinked with river clay. The roof was slate hauled up from a quarry near Boise on a sledge drawn by oxen the brothers had since sold. The chimney was river granite, and the fireplace inside was wide enough for a man to stand in. Beside the cabin stood the smithy. It was an open-sided shed with a slate roof and a stone forge, and an anvil that had come west on a wagon from Pittsburgh. To the south stood the barn, the smokehouse, the spring house, over the cold creek, the chicken coop, and the small second cabin where the 2 younger brothers slept. Caleb Calloway was 34 years old. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall in his stockings. His shoulders were as wide as the door of his own smithy. His hands were the color of old leather, and the hardness of seasoned hickory scarred across the knuckles from years of hammer work, missing the tip of the small finger on his left hand from an accident with a hot tong in 1872. His eyes were the color of dark whiskey. His beard was thick and trimmed close. He wore a leather apron over a faded blue work shirt and dark trousers and good boots. He had paid a Boise cobbler $12 to make for him because his feet were too large for any boot a store sold ready. He had been shaping a plowshare for old man Henderson, who farmed 40 acres of bottomland down in Willow Creek, and who needed the share by Tuesday. The iron was cherry red on the anvil. Caleb had raised his hammer for the next stroke when his nostrils flared and he stopped. He set the hammer down on the anvil. He turned his head into the south wind. He stood completely still for the space of 3 breaths. "Wyatt," he called. His voice was deep and quiet, the voice of a man who had learned that when you are large, there is no reason to ever speak loudly. "Wyatt, are you near?" The middle brother stepped out of the trees 30 yards behind the cabin. Wyatt Calloway carried 3 rabbits by the hind legs freshly snared. His shirt sleeves were rolled. His Henderson rifle was slung across his back. He was the same height as Caleb, the same build, the same face, save that his beard was kept slightly shorter and that there was a thin, pale scar across the bridge of his nose from a fight in 1875 he never spoke about. Wyatt stopped. He raised his face into the wind. His eyes narrowed. "Smoke," he said. 4 miles south, maybe 5. "Grass smoke, not chimney. The wind is from the south, so it is coming up the valley." He set the rabbits on the chopping block. He walked over to the smithy. The 2 brothers stood side by side, sniffing the wind like wolves. "It is bad," Wyatt said. "How bad?" Caleb said. Wyatt watched the southern horizon. A faint dark stain had appeared above the line of the trees, the color of an old bruise. "The valley is dry," Wyatt said. "It has been dry for 6 weeks. If the fire has crowned, it is moving faster than a horse. If there are people in the path, Caleb, they are not getting out." Caleb was already moving. He stripped off the leather apron and let it fall. He walked into the cabin in his long, even strides and came out a moment later wearing a heavier coat and carrying a canvas pack he kept ready for emergencies. Inside the pack were 2 clean linen shirts torn into strips for bandages, a glass jar of bear grease salve mixed with yarrow and golden seal, a tin canteen of clean water, and a bottle of laudanum he had bought from the doctor in Willow Creek for the time his brother Silas broke an arm 2 winters back. "Silas," Wyatt called. "Silas, get out here." The youngest of the 3 brothers came around the corner of the barn at a run. Silas Calloway was 34 years old, born 7 minutes after Wyatt and 14 minutes after Caleb on the same March morning in 1845. He was the largest of the 3, a hair under 6 feet, 6 broader through the shoulders, slower to anger and slower to leave it once it took him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow and his forearms were bloody to the wrist. He had been pulling a calf. The cow had been in trouble for 2 hours, and the calf had finally come out alive a minute before Wyatt called. "Smoke south," Wyatt said. "The valley." Silas wiped his arms on a rag without looking down at them. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the southern sky. He nodded once. "I will get the horses," he said. Caleb did not move. He was looking at Wyatt. He had a thing in his throat that he did not know how to say, and he stood there a moment longer with the canvas pack in his hand, and then he said it. "Wyatt," he paused. "The wagon train. What about it?" "The wagon train from Cheyenne. It was due through the South Valley this week." The 2 younger brothers went very still. The wind moved a strand of Wyatt's hair across his forehead. He did not push it back. "Caleb," Wyatt said quietly, "what are you telling me?" "I am telling you," Caleb said, "that if it is the wagon train, then she was on it." Silas came 1 step closer. His face had changed. His face had the look it took on when something he loved was hurt. The look of a man who has just heard a sound from another room he does not yet understand. "Who?" Silas said. "Caleb." "Who was on it?" Caleb let out a long, slow breath. He set the canvas pack down on the smithy floor. He looked at his 2 younger brothers, the 2 men he had stood beside since the morning he buried their parents on the eastern ridge in June of 1869, the 2 men he had promised his dying mother he would never let be alone, and he told them the truth he had been keeping for 6 months. "I sent for a wife," he said. She was due to arrive in Willow Creek next week. Her name is Elizabeth Hartwell. She is 22 years old. She is from Boston. She has no family. I paid for her passage through the general store 6 months ago, and I never told either of you because I did not know how. He looked down at the iron on the anvil, still glowing faintly in its bed of coals. I did not want you to feel obliged. I did not want you to feel I was taking something for myself that I would not share. I told myself one of us had to carry the name on. I told myself it was on me because I am the eldest by 14 minutes. The truth is, I did not tell you because I was a coward. And now there is a fire in the South Valley, and she may already be dead, and you are hearing about her for the first time over the smell of grass smoke. I am sorry. For a long moment, no one spoke. Silas was the first to move. He walked over to his eldest brother. He did not embrace him. The Calloway brothers were not men who embraced. He simply put one of his enormous, bloody hands on Caleb's shoulder, and he left it there for a count of 3. Then he said, "Get the medical kit. I will saddle the horses. Wyatt, get your rifle and your tracking eye. We argue about this later. We argue when she is safe or when we know she is gone. We do not argue now." He turned and walked toward the barn at a run. Wyatt did not move for another moment. He stood with his arms folded and his eyes on his oldest brother's face. There was something in his expression that was very hard to read. Then it softened just a little around the corners of the mouth. "You are a fool, Caleb," he said quietly. "But you are our fool, and we have always been 3. He picked up his rifle and went to help Silas with the horses. They rode down the mountain hard, Caleb on his big bay gelding Murdoch, Wyatt on the leggy buckskin he called Arrow, Silas on the heavy black draft cross named Job, who had carried him for 9 years and who could go down a slope no other horse on the mountain would attempt. They went down switchback by switchback through the dark pines, the smoke growing thicker as they descended, the air growing hotter. They reached the valley floor an hour later. The bowl of grass where the wagon train had been was a black oval the size of 40 city blocks. The fire had moved on east, was still burning the lower slopes a mile beyond, but the heart of the burn was already cooling into ash and smoke and silence. Wagons stood in the ash like the burned skeletons of small ships. Iron rims of wheels sat flat on the ground where the spokes had cooked away. The smell was indescribable. The smell was not just fire. The smell was everything that had been alive an hour ago and was no longer. Wyatt rode a slow circle around the edge of the burn eyes on the ground. Silas dismounted and walked into the ash with a wet bandana tied across his mouth, calling out, listening, calling out again. Caleb sat his horse at the edge of the burn with his chest tight and the canvas pack across his saddlebow and watched his brothers work. After 10 minutes, Wyatt drew up beside him. He pointed without speaking. "Tracks," he said. "A woman's boots. Heavy travel boots, town-made, not frontier. She came out of the burn over the south rim, stumbling, falling. She is alone. No one followed her." He paused. "She is hurt, Caleb. The stride is wrong. She is not going to keep going much longer." Caleb's heart did a thing in his chest that it did not often do. "Show me," he said. Wyatt rode ahead. Silas mounted up and followed. They climbed the south rim of the burn, and on the far side the ash gave way to a slope of half-burned pines, charred trunks standing in a thinning haze of smoke. Wyatt led them through the trees at a walk, his eyes never leaving the ground. He pointed out things Caleb could not see. A scuff, a heel print, a small dark spot on a fallen log where a hand had touched and left a smear of blood from a blistered palm. The trail wandered like the trail of a sleepwalker. A quarter mile in, Wyatt held up his fist. "She is just ahead," he said quietly. Slow, they walked the horses forward. Through the last screen of smoke, they saw her. She was kneeling at the foot of a dead pine, her hands flat in the ash, her head bowed. Her dark blue traveling dress was streaked with soot, and the hem had burned away in a ragged half-moon. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her shoulders, dusted with ash. The cameo at her throat was warped and dark. Her shoulders moved very slightly with the small breaths she was still managing to take. Caleb dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. He went down the last 20 feet on foot, his great body suddenly careful the way a man approaches a wounded fawn. He knelt in the ash beside her. He did not touch her at first. He only looked at her face. She was paler than he had imagined her. Her lips were cracked. A small streak of blood ran from her hairline down to the corner of her eye and had dried there. The brooch at her throat had melted slightly, and through the ruin of the carving, he could still see faintly the small, sad face of the woman who had been her mother once. He had seen the brooch before. She had drawn a small, careful sketch of it in the corner of her second letter to him beside her name, the way a younger woman might draw a flower. He had carried the letter folded in his Bible for 6 months. "Wyatt," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "It is her." Wyatt and Silas came up behind him. Silas dismounted heavily. He took the canvas pack from Caleb's saddle. He did not speak. He simply unscrewed the canteen and poured a little water onto a strip of clean linen and handed it to his brother. Caleb wiped the blood from her temple with the gentlest stroke his huge calloused hand had ever made. She did not stir. "Is she breathing?" Caleb said. "Tell me." Silas leaned down and put his ear close to her face. He held there a long moment. His broad shoulders were trembling very slightly, and Caleb saw it and understood and said nothing. "She is breathing," Silas said. "She is breathing, Caleb. She is alive." Caleb closed his eyes for 1 second only. When he opened them again, he was the eldest brother, again the man who had buried his parents. The man who had stood for the other two, the man who did not have time for grief or fear. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath the bend of her knees, and he stood. She weighed almost nothing. She weighed less than a sack of feed. She weighed less than the iron on his anvil that morning. "Silas," he said, "your coat." Silas was already pulling off the heavy buffalo hide coat he wore in the high country. He laid it across her like a blanket. Wyatt unbuckled the canteen from his saddle and tucked it into the bundle. Then they mounted and Caleb settled her against his chest in the saddle, one arm around her, one hand on the reins, and they began the long, slow climb back up the mountain to the cabin on Sawtooth Ridge. He did not know yet what he would say to her when she opened her eyes. He did not know yet what she would say to him. He knew only one thing, and he leaned his head down close to her ear as they rode and said it once very quietly in the deep, slow voice of a man making a vow on his own mother's grave. "Do not worry, girl," he said. "You are home now." The cabin was warm. The fire in the great stone hearth had been banked before the brothers rode out and was glowing now in a deep red bed of coals. They laid her on Caleb's bed, the wide bed in the main room with the buffalo robes piled on it and the quilt his mother Eleanor had stitched in 1858. Caleb pulled the quilt over her up to her shoulders. He lit the lantern. He took off his boots so they would not scuff the floor. Silas brought a basin of warm water from the kettle. Wyatt brought clean linens and the jar of bear grease salve. The three brothers stood for a moment around the bed looking down at the small woman in the quilt. None of them speaking, and the look on each of their faces was the same look. It was the look of three men who had just understood that something had walked into their lives that had never been there before, and that nothing on Sawtooth Ridge would ever be quite as it had been. Then Caleb turned to his brothers. "I will see to her," he said. "Wyatt, see to the horses. Silas, get a meal on. Broth, something she can swallow if she wakes." He paused. "Wyatt, when she wakes, she's going to be afraid. She is going to look up and see three men twice her size standing over her. We are going to have to be very careful how we do this." Wyatt nodded once, said nothing, and walked out toward the barn. Silas stayed a moment longer. He was looking down at Elizabeth's face. The lantern light fell on her cheek and caught the faintest movement of breath at her temple. Caleb watched his youngest brother and saw something in him he had not seen in a very long time. Not since the year a 14-year-old girl named Hannah had come down the mountain with a fever and not gone back up. "Silas," Caleb said quietly. Silas did not look up. "I am all right," Silas said. "Are you?" "I am all right." He drew a long, slow breath. "She is not Hannah, Caleb. I know that. I am all right. He turned and walked out to the kitchen end of the cabin and began with hands that were larger than most men's heads to cut a chicken into pieces small enough to make broth a sleeping woman could swallow. Caleb sat on the wooden stool beside the bed. He took her left hand in both of his. The hand was small and cold, and the knuckles were scraped raw. He turned it over. The palm was a single blistered burn, the skin shining and red. He uncorked the jar of salve and dipped 2 fingers and began with a touch lighter than any touch his hands had ever managed to ease the salve onto the burn. Then he wrapped the hand in a strip of clean linen. Then he did the right hand the same way. He worked for almost an hour. The blistered patch on her left forearm, the burn at the line of her trough, the shallow cut at her temple, which he cleaned and butterflied with 2 strips of linen he tore narrow with his teeth. When he was done, he looked at her face for a long time. He thought of the letter folded in his Bible and the small sketch of the cameo in the corner. He thought of the long winter coming. He thought of Wyatt and Silas and the explanation he still owed them. He thought of all the things he had not told her in his letter, the way the wind sounded at the lone pine on the eastern ridge, the way his mother had looked the morning she died, the way the iron on the anvil sang under a true hammer stroke when the temperature was right. He would tell her all of it, he thought. He would tell her everything. Even the things he had never told anyone, if she would only wake up and choose to stay. He did not know yet that there was a man down in Willow Creek named Roland Blackwood who had already heard by means he should not have heard it about a young woman pulled alive from the wagon train fire by the Calloway brothers of Sawtooth Ridge. He did not know yet that Blackwood had already sent for a man named Jeb Morgan, a man with a sickle scar on his cheek and 11 killings on his ledger, currently riding north out of Boise on a black Mustang. He did not know yet that the same fire that had brought Elizabeth Hartwell into his arms had also lit a slower and far more patient fire under his own family's mountain, and that the smoke from that second fire would be 6 months in coming. He knew only that her breathing was even and that her face in the lantern light was the face from the small drawing in the corner of the second letter, and that it was the face of the woman he had been waiting 6 months to meet. Outside, the wind shifted at last out of the south. The smoke that had risen from the valley floor began to drift away to the east. Wyatt finished with the horses and came in and stood by the door without speaking, watching his brother sit beside the woman on the bed. In the kitchen end of the cabin, Silas worked the cut chicken into the kettle in slow, even motions, and his great shoulders were turned slightly away from the bed, and once, only once, he reached up with the back of his wrist and wiped his eye, and then he went on with his work. The fire popped in the hearth. The lantern burned steady. And Elizabeth Hartwell, who had set out that morning, still believing she was alone in the world, slept on in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's cabin, with the gentlest hand she had ever been touched, by resting very lightly around her bandaged fingers. And she did not yet know that she had been carried up out of the smoke by 3 men, and she did not yet know that one of them had sworn to her while she slept that she was already home. She would learn all of these things in the morning. In the morning, she would open her eyes and she would scream, and the long winter would begin. She woke to firelight. The first thing she understood was that she was not cold. The second thing she understood was that she was not alone. The third thing was that the ceiling above her was made of squared pine logs, darker than any wood she had ever seen in a Boston room, and that there was a smell in the air she did not recognize at first, and then placed slowly one note at a time. Wood smoke, bear grease, coffee, pine sap, and under all of it, faintly the smell of iron. She turned her head. The motion sent a hot line of pain across her temple, and she made a small sound she did not mean to make. The shape sitting beside the bed lifted its head. It was a man. He was enormous. He was a black bearded silhouette against the firelight shoulders like the shoulders of a draft horse, and he was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and her left hand was lying across his open palm. Elizabeth Hartwell screamed. She screamed and pushed herself backward against the headboard, and the pain in her bandaged hands made her scream a second time, and the man rose to his feet with both his huge palms held out flat where she could see them, and he was speaking, and she could not hear what he was saying because her own breath was too loud in her ears. Two more shapes appeared in the doorway. Two more men, both of them nearly as large as the first. Both of them with the same bearded face and the same dark whiskey eyes catching the firelight. And for one long, terrible moment, Elizabeth believed that the smoke had finally taken her after all, and that hell, when it came for a woman, came in threes. Easy, the first man said. His voice was very low, very slow. It was the voice of a man speaking to a horse that had bolted. Easy, miss, easy. Look at me. Look at my hands. There is nothing in them. Look, nothing. She looked at his hands. They were the size of dinner plates. The knuckles were scarred. The little finger on the left was missing its tip. They were empty. I'm going to step back, the man said. I am going to step 3 steps back from the bed. Watch me do it. He stepped back. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at the foot of the bed. The other two men had not moved from the doorway. They had simply lowered themselves one on each side of the frame until they were no longer towering. The largest of the three, the one furthest from her, had crouched down on his heels, with his arms loose between his knees, the way a man crouches when he wants to be smaller than a child. My name is Caleb Calloway, the first man said. I wrote the letter. I am the one who sent for you. The man on the left is Wyatt. The man on the right is Silas. They are my brothers. We were born on the same morning, the three of us, in March of 45. I should have told you in the letter that we lived together. I did not tell you. I was afraid you would not come. That was not honest of me, and I am asking your forgiveness for it now. Elizabeth could not speak. She had pressed herself so far back against the headboard that the carved wood was cutting into her shoulder blades. Caleb did not move closer. He stayed at the foot of the bed. You are in my cabin, he said. You are on Sawtooth Ridge. We found you yesterday in the burn south of here. We brought you up the mountain. Your hands are bandaged because they are blistered. There is a cut at your temple. You have been asleep for almost a full day. He paused. No one in this house has touched you, Miss Hartwell, except to clean your wounds and put salve on your burns. No one is going to touch you now. You are safe in this room. You have my word as a man on it. The youngest of the three brothers, the one crouched in the doorway on the right, spoke for the first time. His voice was even quieter than Caleb's, and there was something in it that surprised her, a softness that did not match the size of the body it came from. There is a bolt on the door of the west room, he said. It is 2 inches thick. I put it on this morning before you woke. If you want to sleep there with the door bolted from the inside, you can. We will not knock. We will not call to you through the door. You will eat when you choose to eat and sleep when you choose to sleep, and when you are strong enough to ride, one of us will take you wherever you wish to go in the world. You name the place. We will take you there. The middle brother Wyatt spoke next. A Calloway man keeps his word, he said. The three of them did not move. They simply waited. They waited the way men wait by a campfire for a kettle to boil. They were not in a hurry. They were not asking her to do anything. They were giving her with their stillness the only gift 3 men of that size could give a frightened woman in a stranger's bed. They were giving her time. Elizabeth's breath, which had been coming in short, bright gasps, began at last to slow. Her shoulders, locked against the headboard, began to ease down by the smallest fraction. She looked at Caleb's face. She looked at the careful slant of his beard, the tired skin under his eyes, the way he was holding himself half turned away, as if even his profile was something he was trying to make smaller. Your letter, she said. Her voice was a rasp. The letter said you were 34. I am 34, Caleb said. You did not say there were 3 of you. No, ma'am, he said. I did not. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the 3 men were still there in the same positions, like figures in a painting that had agreed not to move while she was looking away. How long, she said. How long until what, miss? How long until the snow? The 3 brothers looked at each other. 6 weeks, Caleb said. Maybe 7. Then the pass closes till March. She let her head fall back against the wood. She thought of Boston. She thought of $11.47. She thought of Mildred Whitmore in a gray silk wrapper. She thought of Mary Patterson and could not bear it and stopped. I am very tired, she said. I know, Caleb said. Sleep, miss. We will be in the next room. Bolt this door if it will help you sleep. There is broth on the hearth when you want it. Silas made it. He turned to go. At the doorway he paused, one hand on the frame, and without looking back he said in that same low, slow voice, as if the words were not for her at all but for the room itself, "You are home now." Then he was gone, and the brothers were gone, and the door closed behind them, and Elizabeth Hartwell lay alone in the firelight in a stranger's bed, and slowly, slowly she got up and crossed the cold floor and slid the bolt across the door, and just as slowly she went back to the bed and lay down again, and she did not sleep for a long time. And when she finally did sleep, she dreamed of a hammer ringing on iron in a place she had never been, and in the dream the sound was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. In the morning when she opened the door, three things were sitting on the small wooden table outside her room. A wooden comb of dark walnut carved smooth with two letters cut into the back of it, the letters E and H in a careful hand. A small bouquet of dried columbine wildflowers tied with a strip of linen set into a tin cup of water. A pair of soft deer hide moccasins stitched with sinew, the soles thick, the size exactly right for her foot. There was no note. She sat down in the doorway with the three gifts in her lap, and she cried for a long time the way a woman cries when she has just understood that someone has looked at her, really looked at her, and seen what she needed without asking. 3 days later, when she could stand long enough to walk the length of the cabin without holding the wall, Caleb sat down across from her at the long pine table and laid out the terms. He spoke the way she imagined he would have spoken to a buyer who had come up the mountain to argue over the price of a plowshare. Steady, plain, without flourishes. There are two roads, he said. The first road is this. I take you down to Willow Creek before the snow. I put you on a stagecoach to Cheyenne. I pay your fare back to Boston, and I give you $100 in coin for your trouble. You go home. We never see one another again. I think no less of you for choosing it. The second road, he said, is that you stay until spring. I sleep out at the smithy. There is a small bunkhouse there that I built for a journeyman I never hired. Wyatt and Silas keep their cabin to the east where they have always slept. You take the main bed in this house. You cook. We provide. When the pass opens in March, if you choose to stay on as my wife, we go down to Willow Creek and the preacher Ainsworth marries us proper, and the thing is done. If you choose to go, then I take you wherever in this country you wish to go, and I give you $200 and my best wishes, and we part as friends. There is no obligation in this house except the one you yourself choose. You are not bought. You are not promised. You are a guest until you decide otherwise. She listened. She watched his hands while he spoke. He had set them flat on the table between them, and he had not moved them once. They were not the hands of a man making a play. They were the hands of a man who had laid his cards down face up and had no intention of touching them again. Why, she said at last. Why, what, miss? Why are you being kind to me? You do not know me. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes went past her to the window above the sink. Outside, the first of the autumn aspens were turning the color of new copper. My mother, he said quietly. My mother was a lonely girl in Pittsburgh in 1842. My father found her. He treated her well. She gave him 27 years of a life she had not believed she would live to see. I do not know how to look at a woman in the position you are in and not think of my mother. I do not know how to do that, Miss Hartwell. I am sorry if it is a poor answer. She did not answer for a while. Then she reached for the pen and the small ledger on the table, and in her careful Boston hand, she signed her name beneath the words he had written out for her the night before. Her hand shook. The letters were straight. Caleb folded the paper and put it in the iron strong box under the bed and did not look at it again for the rest of that winter. The first weeks were a slow, careful learning of one another, the way a horse new to a barn learns where the doors are. In the second week, Caleb taught her about the forge. She came out one cold, blue morning with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and stood at a distance watching him work. He saw her and lowered the hammer. "Stand 6 feet back," he said. "The sparks will eat through wool in a heartbeat." She stood 6 feet back. "Iron has 5 colors when it is hot," he said. He did not look at her while he spoke. He kept his eyes on the bar and the coals. Black is cold, will not move under the hammer. Blood red is the start. The iron is starting to think. Cherry red is the working color. Cherry is where most of the work gets done. Orange is hot enough to move easy, but you have to be quick or you will lose the heat before the shape sets. White hot, he said. White hot is a young man's mistake. The iron will crack. The iron will spit. White hot is what kills good steel. He pulled the bar from the coals. It was the color of a ripe apricot. He laid it on the anvil and struck 3 measured blows, then turned the bar a quarter and struck 3 more, and the rhythm of his hammer was a sound she could feel in her chest more than she could hear it. Then he plunged it into the oil barrel beside the anvil, and a great hiss of steam came up around him, and for a second she could not see him at all. "Why oil?" she said when the steam cleared. "Why not water? Water cools the iron too fast for some pieces. Iron quenched in water is hard. Iron quenched in oil is tougher. Water is for blades. Water is for plows. Oil is for hinges and horseshoes, the things that have to bend a little under a load and then come back." He looked at her for the first time since she had arrived at the smithy. "Iron is not destroyed by fire, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Iron is shaped by it. There is a difference." She did not know yet that she would think about that sentence for the rest of her life. In the third week, Wyatt taught her how to read the ground. He took her with him on the morning circuit of the rabbit snares. He walked slowly. He did not look back to check if she was keeping up. He simply slowed his pace until the slow pace was the pace they were both walking, and after a little while she realized that this was the kindest thing a man like Wyatt was capable of doing for a woman like her, and her eyes stung, and she did not say anything about it. "You see this?" he said, kneeling on one knee in the soft earth at the edge of a stand of aspens. He did not point, he simply tilted his head. "Deer track. 4 toes, heart shape, 2 days old." "How can you tell 2 days?" she said. "Edges," he said. "Soft means yesterday. Hard means 2 days. Frost in the print means cold night. Dew in the print means morning. Windblown means longer than 3 days. You read edges, you read time. Mountain does not lie about time. People lie. Mountain does not lie." She thought he was finished, but he stayed crouched a moment longer, looking at the small print in the dirt, and then he said without looking at her, "My father taught me this. Every morning from when I was 6 years old. He was killed when I was 24. I have been reading the ground for 28 years, Miss Hartwell. I taught my brothers. They are good. I am better." He stood up. "Anything you want to know about the ground on this mountain, you ask me. You ask me and I will tell you the truth." She walked the rest of the circuit beside him and learned the difference between a wolf print and a coyote print, between a black bear print and a grizzly print, between the soft, round print of a mountain lion that had passed in the night and the smaller scuffed print of the bobcat that had crossed an hour after. She did not yet understand that the lessons were not really lessons. The lessons were a man telling a woman that he saw her and that he was placing in her hands a knowledge she could carry alone. In the 4th week, the trouble with the cow came. Her name was Daisy. She was a milk cow, 4 years old, the best milker in the small herd, 4 gallons a day. Silas had pulled her calf the morning of the fire, and the calf had lived, and Daisy had been right as rain for 3 weeks. That morning she would not eat. She would not move. Her left flank was distended and tight as a drum. When Silas pressed his palm to it, the skin barely gave. The cow's eyes were rolled and wet, and her breath was coming in shallow gusts. "Bloat," Silas said. He said it the way a doctor says a hard word to a family in a waiting room. "Gas in the rumen. She has been at the wet clover up the slope. If we do not get the gas out of her in the next hour, she will go down, and once she goes down, she will not get up." Wyatt was 3 miles off setting traps on the North Fork. Caleb was at the smithy arms deep in a wagon axle that could not be left. Silas worked alone in the barn. His huge hands moved over the cow's belly with a softness that made Elizabeth watching from the barn door with a basket of kitchen scraps for the chickens, set the basket down very slowly and step inside. "Can I help?" she said. Silas turned his head. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and said, "You ever been near a cow in this kind of trouble, Miss Hartwell?" "I have not," she said. "It is not pretty. It is loud. There will be smell. Some women even on the mountain walk away from this part. I would not think less of you if you did." "I would think less of myself," she said. Something moved across the back of his eyes that she did not have a name for. He nodded once. "Then come hold her head," he said. "I need her still. If she swings while I am working, I will tear something inside her, and we will lose her anyway." She walked into the barn. The barn smelled of straw and hot animal and fear. She knelt beside Daisy's heavy head. The cow's eye, big as a brown apple, rolled toward her and held there. Elizabeth took the bridle with both her bandaged hands and pressed her cheek against the broad, warm bone of the cow's forehead and began to whisper to her the way she had heard Silas whisper to the calf the morning of the fire. "Easy, girl, easy now. We have you. We have you. Easy." Silas worked behind her with an instrument she did not look at and did not want to know about. There was a long bovine groan that seemed to come from the inside of the earth itself, and then there was a long, deep release of trapped gay, and Daisy's whole body sagged, and her eyes softened, and the tight drum of her flank slowly gave way under Silas's enormous, careful hand. It was 20 minutes before the cow could stand. Silas and Elizabeth stood her up together. Elizabeth had one hand on the bridle and the other braced against the cow's shoulder, and Silas had both his hands under the hip bones lifting, and somewhere in the middle of the lift, their hands brushed against one another on the cow's hot, dusty hide. Both of them stopped. It was an inch of contact, the smallest possible accidental touch. The skin of the back of his hand against the skin of the back of hers, ash and dirt between them, the heat of the animal under their palms. They both pulled back at the same time. Silas turned his face away and took a step to the cow's other side and bent to check the legs. Elizabeth did not move for a count of 3. Then she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and she went around to the cow's head and rubbed Daisy's broad, bony forehead, and she did not look at Silas, and Silas did not look at her, and neither of them said a word about it then or ever. The cow lived. In the kitchen that night, Silas spooned stew into bowls. He did not meet her eyes when he set the bowl in front of her. He said only, "You did good into the barn, Miss Hartwell. Not every Boston woman would have stayed." "I am not every Boston woman, Mr. Calloway," she said. He almost smiled. He did not quite. That fact, he said, is becoming clear. The first deep talk came on a night in late October when the wind was high and the rain had turned to sleet against the window, and Wyatt, asleep in the small east cabin, had begun to dream the dream he had brought home from the Wilderness Campaign in 1864, the dream that began with a man calling for water and ended with a sound Wyatt would not describe. The brothers had a system for it. When the wind was wrong, one of them slept in the main cabin at the hearth, so that if Wyatt woke shouting, someone could be at his door inside of a minute. That night it was Caleb's turn. He sat in the rocker by the fire with a tin cup of black coffee and a leather-bound copy of his mother's Bible open across his knee. Elizabeth could not sleep. The thunder of the sleet on the roof was unfamiliar. The bolt was on her door. She slid it back. She pulled a quilt around her shoulders and walked out into the main room in her stocking feet. "You are not asleep," Caleb said without looking up. "The storm. Wyatt has bad nights when the wind is up," he said. "I sit out here on the wind nights. Silas takes the still nights. We have done it this way since '65. She sat down in the chair across from him. The fire threw its red and gold across the right side of his face and left the left side in shadow. "What was the war for him?" she said. He closed the Bible. He set it on the small table beside him. The wilderness, he said, May of 64. He was 19 years old. I was 19 also. We had lied about our ages and enlisted in 63 together. Silas was with us. The three of us served 2 years in the Army of the Potomac. We did not come home until June of 65. She said nothing. There was a man, Caleb said. A boy, really. Pennsylvania volunteers. Caught in a brush fire in the middle of the second day. The trees had been hit by shell. We could not reach him. He called for water for an hour. Then he called for his mother. Then he stopped calling. Wyatt was 20 feet from him the whole time. Wyatt has not slept through a thunderstorm in 15 years. Elizabeth's eyes stung. I am sorry, she said. You did not do it. I am still sorry. Caleb looked into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered another half a step into the place where men keep the things they do not often take out and look at. My father was killed in June of 69, he said. Bandits on the Lewiston Pass. They took the $400 he was bringing up to finish the cabin. They shot him in the chest. They shot my mother in the stomach because she went for the rifle. Father died in my arms in a doctor's room in Boise 2 days later. He told me to look after the boys. Mother took 4 days. She told me the same thing on the last day. She held my hand. She said, do not let them be alone in this world, Caleb. I was 24 years old. Wyatt was the same. So was Silas. He stopped. The fire popped. He did not wipe his eyes. There was nothing in his eyes to wipe. I buried them on the eastern ridge under the lone pine, he said. We built this cabin around their grave that summer. We swore to each other we would not leave the mountain. 10 years come this past June. Elizabeth pressed her hand flat to her mouth. After a moment, she lowered it and told him about the printer's shop on Beacon Street, and her father coughing into a handkerchief by the window, and her mother dying in childbed when she was 12. And then because his face had become a face, it was possible to tell anything to. She told him about Charles Whitmore and the writing desk and the corner of it and the blood in the morning Mildred had stood in her doorway in a gray silk wrapper. Halfway through the telling, a chair scraped softly in the dark corner of the room. Silas had been in the cabin the whole time. He had come in from the second cabin an hour before to bring more coffee and had sat down in the deep shadow by the door, and Elizabeth had not seen him. He stood up now. He did not look at either of them. He walked across the room and out the front door without his coat and pulled it shut quietly behind him. The sleet was loud against the slate roof. Elizabeth turned her face to Caleb. She did not have to ask. Hannah, Caleb said. Who is Hannah? There was a Swallow girl who came to us in 72. Her people died of the fever. We took her in. She was 11. By the time she was 14, she was the brightest thing on this mountain. In the spring of 75, Silas took her down to Boise to buy a Sunday dress and a pair of shoes. He went into the dry goods store. He left her on the bench out front. He was inside for 10 minutes. When he came out, a man named Gallagher, a wealthy man, had her by the arm and was walking her toward an alley. Silas put that man through a plate glass window. The sheriff said it was assault. Silas spent 11 days in the Boise jail. Gallagher's lawyers paid the sheriff. Hannah came home to us. She had a fever by the end of the week. She was not the same girl. By Easter, she was gone. The sleet was still coming down. Silas blames himself, Elizabeth said very softly. Silas blames himself, Caleb said. He has blamed himself for 4 years. When you came up that hill in his arms, out of the burn, with hair the color of hers, and your face turned the way her face used to turn, he held it together. But it cost him something. He treats you as a sister, Miss Hartwell. He will treat you that way for the rest of his life. He will die before he lets a hand be laid on you into this house. I tell you so that you understand what kind of man he is, and so that you do not mistake his quiet for coldness. She nodded. She could not speak. A long minute passed. A Callaway man keeps his word, Caleb said very quietly, almost to himself. That is not just something we say, miss. That is the thing we have left of him. Of our father. She reached across the small space between their chairs and laid her bandaged hand over his on the arm of the rocker. She did not press. She simply rested her hand there. He did not move his hand. He did not look at her hand. He looked into the fire. After a while, she stood up and went back to the west room and bolted the door, and she lay in the bed and listened to the sleet. And somewhere beyond the wall, she heard Silas come back into the cabin and sit down quietly in the chair by the door. And she heard Caleb say something in a low voice she could not make out. And Silas answered in a low voice she could not make out. And then there was only the fire and the sleet, and she slept. He came up the path on a black Mustang on the third day of November, when the first snow was already dusting the high meadow and the sky over Sawtooth Ridge had gone a deep and unfriendly gray. Jeb Morgan was 40 years old. He wore a black oilskin coat to his knees. He had a Colt 44 on his right hip and a knife on his left. There was a sickle-shaped scar on his right cheek that ran from the corner of his eye to the edge of his jaw, and his teeth were yellow from the tobacco he chewed. And he smiled at the three brothers on the porch, the way a man smiles when he is selling something he knows is not what it appears to be. Caleb stood on the top step. Wyatt stood at the rail with his rifle leaned just inside the door, where his hand could reach it without seeming to. Silas leaned in the open doorway with his arms folded. Elizabeth stood 3 feet inside the cabin behind the curtain that hung across the kitchen window, where she could see Jeb's face, but he could not see hers. Mayor Roland Blackwood of Willow Creek sends his greetings to the Calloway brothers, Jeb Morgan said. His voice was honey poured over gravel. My name is Morgan. I am the mayor's land inspector. Word has come to us gentlemen that you took a young lady out of the wagon train fire last month. The mayor wishes me to convey the joyful news that her wagon train has reached Willow Creek and that the company is anxious for word of her. Mary Patterson has been delivered of a fine son. They are hoping to push on to Oregon by week's end. If the lady is fit to travel, I have a wagon at the foot of the mountain to bring her down to her people. Behind the curtain, Elizabeth's hand went to her mouth. She is alive, she thought. Mary is alive. But Wyatt had not moved. Wyatt was looking at Jeb Morgan's face the way a hawk looks at the grass. He spoke before Caleb could. How did you know she was here, mister? We have not sent word to anyone. Word travels in the mountains, Jeb said. He smiled wider. A timberman saw your brothers carrying her up the ridge. What timberman? Wyatt said. What name? Jeb's smile flickered. A small tick at the corner of his mouth, the size of a hummingbird's wing. I do not have his name, he said. The mayor sent me up in some haste. I know every timberman within 50 miles, Wyatt said. Quietly, there is no working camp south of here this month. The crews moved north to the Salmon River 3 weeks ago for the winter cut. Jeb's smile held. The eyes did not. Caleb spoke for the first time. The lady will decide, he said. She is still recovering from the fire. She is not strong enough to ride down today. You may return on Monday. She will tell you herself what she wishes. Jeb's tongue moved slowly across his lower lip. The mayor does not like to be kept waiting, Mr. Calloway. Then the mayor will have to learn patience, Caleb said. Jeb looked at him a long second. Then he tipped his hat with 2 fingers and turned the Mustang and rode back down the trail. The 3 brothers watched him until he had passed the last bend. Silas spoke first. He is not from Willow Creek, Silas said. Willow Creek is 40 miles. That Mustang has cedar burr on his fetlock. There is no cedar burr north of Boise. He came up the Boise Road. His eyes do not come to the eyes of the people he is talking to, Wyatt said. A man telling the truth looks at the eyes of a woman he is speaking about. He did not look at Miss Hartwell once, even though he knew she was inside. Caleb did not speak. He was watching the empty trail. Elizabeth came out from behind the curtain. Her face had gone very pale. Mary, she said. He said Mary is alive. He said many things, Caleb said. He said Mary had a son. She is going to have a girl, Elizabeth said quietly. She told me on the trail. She said she had known since the 2nd month. She said a mother knows. The 3 brothers looked at her. Wyatt let out a long, slow breath through his nose. It is a lie, Caleb said. It is a lie, Wyatt said. What does he want? Elizabeth said. She had stopped trembling. The Boston in her, the part of her that had survived Mildred Whitmore and an empty boarding house and a wagon train on fire, was beginning to stand up. I do not know, Caleb said, but I am going to find out before Monday. Wyatt rode out for Willow Creek the next morning before dawn. He took only what he could carry on a saddle. He kissed his mother's grave on the way down past the lone pine, the way the brothers always did before a journey, and he was 3 days gone. When he came back, he sat the four of them down at the long pine table and laid the truth out the way Caleb laid out iron on the anvil, one piece at a time. The wagon train left Willow Creek for Salem 3 weeks ago, Wyatt said. They went on the southern road. They believe Miss Hartwell dead in the burn. Mary Patterson left a letter for her at the general store in case she should turn up with directions to the Patterson farm 3 miles east of Salem. She is alive. She had a daughter. She named her Hope. Elizabeth pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes. There is more, Wyatt said. Caleb said, tell it. Mayor Blackwood hired a mining engineer out of Denver in the spring. The engineer went over the south face of this mountain 2 months while we were busy at the smithy and the herd. The engineer's report is filed in the Willow Creek courthouse. I paid the clerk $3 for a look at it. There is high-grade iron ore under our south face, gentlemen. Maybe $100,000 worth if you bring the rail in close enough to haul it. Blackwood has tried to buy this land off Caleb 3 times in 3 years. Caleb has said no 3 times. Caleb's mouth had gone hard. There is more still, Wyatt said. 2 years ago, a timberman named Jacobson lived 10 miles north of here, fell off the falls above his own cabin one Sunday morning. His widow could not afford the lawyer fees to keep the parcel. Blackwood bought the land off her for 40 cents on the dollar. She took the money and went home to Iowa. Last year, a trapper named Decker lived south of Henderson's place, was shot in his own dooryard by a hunter who claimed to be drunk and could not be found again. Decker had no kin. The county auctioned his parcel. Blackwood bought it for less than the back taxes. Silas had risen from the table. He was standing at the window with his back to the room. His shoulders were the kind of still that comes before motion. Jeb Morgan, Wyatt said, has 11 killings on his record between Texas and Idaho. He has been seen drinking with the mayor in the back room of the Willow Creek Hotel 3 nights in the last 2 weeks. He arrived in Boise on the train from Cheyenne the day after the wagon train fire. The room was very quiet, so Caleb said. So Wyatt said, the plan is this. Jeb Morgan rides up here Monday. He takes Miss Hartwell down the mountain. She does not arrive at the wagon train because there is no wagon train. She arrives at the mayor's house. There she is persuaded, or she is forced to put her name on a paper that says the Calloway brothers held her against her will and assaulted her. Or if she will not sign, she has a sad accident and a note is found in her hand, and a hand close enough to her own accusing us of the same things. Either way we hang. Either way the land goes to the next of kin of which we have none. Either way Blackwood owns this mountain and the iron under it. Silas turned around from the window. His eyes were the color of cold whiskey. I will go down there tonight, he said. I will end this tonight. You will not, Caleb said. He said it without raising his voice. You will not, Silas, because the day you ride down there alone is the day Blackwood gets the legal hanging he has been trying to engineer. We are not going to give it to him. Then what Silas said. Caleb said. We sit on this mountain through the winter. The pass closes in 2 weeks. He cannot get a force up here through 6 feet of snow. We use the winter to be sure of our case. When the pass opens in March, we ride to Boise. Not Willow Creek. Boise. We go to the federal marshal there. Miss Hartwell tells him what she knows. Wyatt tells him what is in the courthouse files. We bring the law down on Blackwood from above where his money cannot reach. He looked at Elizabeth. That is, he said, if Miss Hartwell is willing to stay. Elizabeth looked at the four of them. She looked at Caleb's hands on the table. She looked at Silas's broad back at the window. She looked at Wyatt's tired face above the road dust still on his collar from 3 days in the saddle. She had come west to marry a stranger. She had not yet come west to fight one. Mr. Calloway, she said. Her voice had the clean edge it had carried into the breakfast room of Mildred Whitmore on her last morning in Boston. I am not going anywhere. You have my word as a Hartwell on it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. A Hartwell keeps her word, he said quietly. Then so do we. Outside the kitchen window, the first heavy snow of the season was beginning to fall on the high meadow. By morning, the pass was 3 feet under, and by the end of the week, it was 6, and the long winter on Sawtooth Ridge had begun, and somewhere far below them, a man with a sickle scar on his cheek was sitting in a back room in Willow Creek, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, listening to the snow fall on the roof and waiting with a patience he had bought and paid for the spring. The snow came down for 9 days without stopping. By the morning of the 10th day, the trail to Willow Creek was gone. The lower pass was buried under 6 feet, the upper pass under 9. The world from the porch of the cabin on Sawtooth Ridge was a single white silence broken only by the slow, black pillar of smoke from the chimney and the occasional crack of a frozen branch giving way in the timber. The mountain had closed its door. Whatever had been left undone in the lowlands would have to wait for March. Whatever was inside the cabin walls now would have to live inside them until the thaw. Elizabeth Hartwell stood at the kitchen window on the morning of the first clear day after the storm and watched Caleb Calloway dig. He was digging a tunnel. He was digging a tunnel from the cabin door to the barn door, and from the barn door to the smithy, and from the smithy to the woodshed, and from the woodshed to the chicken coop. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and as deep as he was tall, and he was waist deep in it now, throwing the snow up over his shoulder. Shoulder with an iron shovel he had forged himself the previous spring, and he had been at it since before dawn. By mid-morning he had reached the barn. By noon he had reached the smithy. He came in for 1 cup of coffee and a bowl of beans and went out again. By sunset, the path to the chicken coop was open, and the chickens had been fed, and the cow had been milked, and the horses had been watered, and the wood for the night had been split, and Caleb came in and sat down at the table with his hair full of melted snow and steam rising from the wool of his coat, and he ate his stew slowly and without speaking, and when he was finished, he set the spoon in the bowl and looked at her and said, "We do this every morning until March, Miss Hartwell. The day we stop digging, the cattle die." She nodded. "I thought you might want to know how it goes," he said. "Thank you," she said. That was all. That was the whole conversation. But after he had gone out to the smithy bunk that night, she sat in the rocker by the fire with the Bible open on her lap, and she thought, he told me. He did not have to tell me. He told me because he thought I might want to know how it goes. She had been a governess for 6 years in a house on Commonwealth Avenue. She had made 100 breakfasts in that house and laid out 1,000 dresses, and not once in 6 years had any member of that family ever stopped at the kitchen door to tell her how the morning was going to go. She set the Bible on the table beside her. She wiped her eyes once with the back of her wrist. She went to bed. The first deep weeks of the winter were like that, small things, the smallest things. A man pausing at a door to tell a woman about a tunnel. The work of the winter, when she looked at it later, came in seasons within the season. The first season was the season of bread. She had baked bread before in Boston in a coal oven that ran at one steady temperature you could check with a thermometer. The cook stove in the Calloway cabin was a black iron thing the size of a coffin with 6 lids on top and 2 ovens at the side and a hot water reservoir at the back. And it ran on whatever wood you fed it, and the temperature of it was a thing you learned by holding your hand in the oven and counting how long you could keep it there before you had to pull it out. 3 seconds was hot enough for biscuits. 5 seconds was right for bread. 8 seconds and you were burning the loaves. The first 3 loaves she baked were bricks. The next 2 burned on the bottom and were raw in the middle. The 6th one rose so high it pushed the lid off the bread tin and came out of the oven looking like a strange, pale mushroom, and she set it on the table and said very quietly in a voice that was not quite a curse, "I cannot do anything right in this country." Wyatt was sitting at the table cleaning his rifle. He looked at the loaf. He looked at her. He did not laugh. He did not even smile. "Eat the top of that one," he said. "The top is fine. Throw the bottom out for the chickens. Try the seventh. She tried the seventh. The seventh was bread. By the end of the third week of December, she had baked a loaf a day for 19 days, and by Christmas Eve, when she pulled the day's loaf out of the oven and tapped the crust with her knuckle and heard the right hollow ring, come back Silas Calloway, who had walked into the cabin behind her with an armload of wood, set the wood down very carefully and said in his low, slow voice, "That sound there, Miss Hartwell, that is the sound my mother's bread used to make." She did not turn around. She set the loaf on the cooling rack. She kept her back to him for a count of 3. Then she said in a voice she made stay even, "Thank you, Silas. That was all. That was enough." The second season was the season of reading. She had not meant to find out that Wyatt Calloway could not read. It happened by accident on a January evening when she was sitting at the long table mending a tear in one of Caleb's work shirts, and Wyatt was sitting across from her cleaning a leather strap that had come loose on a snowshoe, and Caleb had pulled an old letter out of the strong box at the foot of the bed to check a date in it, and he had set it on the table between them and gone outside for a moment, and Wyatt had glanced at the letter the way any man glances at a piece of paper near his hand, and Elizabeth had seen the way his eyes did not move along the lines. They had stopped at the first word. They had not gone further. She kept her face still. She did not look up from her mending. A few minutes later, she said very lightly, "Wyatt, may I ask you a question?" "You may." "Did your father ever teach you to read?" He went very still on the other side of the table. Then he set the leather strap down. He did not look at her. He looked at his own hands. "He started," Wyatt said. "He started with me and Caleb when we were 8. Caleb took to it. I did not. The letters did not stay where I put them. They moved on the page. Father was patient with me a long time. Then the war came and we were keen, and after the war, there was the cabin to build and the herd to start, and Caleb did the reading for the family. He has done it ever since. He has never once said a word about it." He paused, his jaw worked. "I read the ground," he said quietly. "I have always read the ground." Caleb reads the page. Elizabeth set her mending down. "Wyatt," she said. He looked up at her at last. "I will teach you," she said, "if you are willing. We will start tomorrow night, half an hour after supper. I will teach you to read the page. In return, this winter you teach me to read the sky. You teach me to read the weather the way you read it. We make a trade, not a lesson. A trade. 2 adults, 2 skills." Wyatt looked at her for a long time. Something behind his eyes that had been locked down for a long time loosened by half an inch. "That he said is a fair trade, Miss Hartwell." The next night they began. She started with the alphabet on a slate she had made him buy in Willow Creek that fall. She did not patronize him. She did not slow down for him. She treated him the way she had treated her best students in Boston, the boys whose minds were sharp but whose patience was short. She told him the letters did not move on the page. The trick was that the eye moved on the page. She taught him to follow his own finger across the line. By the second week of January, he could read the word God. By the third week, he could read the first verse of Genesis. By the second week of February, he could sit by the fire after supper and read aloud slowly and with pauses the 23rd Psalm, and on the night he read it through without stopping, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Silas, who had been sitting in the chair by the door, pretending to oil a saddle and not pretending very well, set the saddle down on the floor and clapped his huge hands together, once very loud, and said in a voice too rough to hide what was in it, "By God, brother, by God." Wyatt did not look up from the page. He kept his finger on the line. But the corner of his mouth moved just a little, and Elizabeth, sitting across the firelight from him with her own Bible closed on her lap, understood that she had given him something that was not a lesson and not a trade. She had given him a thing he had carried alone for 27 years and would not have to carry alone anymore. In return, on the cold blue afternoons when the storm slept, Wyatt took her out onto the porch and pointed up at the sky and taught her the difference between the high white mare's tail clouds that meant fair weather for 36 hours and the low gray mackerel clouds that meant snow inside a day, and how the wind shifting from west to north meant the storm that was coming would be the long kind, and how the wind shifting from north to east meant the storm would be hard but short. Mountain does not lie, he told her again. People lie. Mountain does not. The third season was the season of the storm. It came in the second week of February after a stretch of unusually mild days that had thawed the upper crust of the snowpack and let the wind reach down into the dry powder beneath. The mare's tails had come in at noon. By dusk, the wind had backed from west to north. By midnight, the cabin was being struck by gusts that shook the slate on the roof and rattled the iron stovepipe and made the heavy oak door shudder against its bolts. It was at 1:30 in the morning by the small mantel clock Caleb had wound that afternoon that they heard the sound. A long, deep crack like a rifle shot, but slower drawn out, and after it, a heavier sound, a thud that came up through the floorboards. A tree, Caleb said. He was already pulling his boots on. Close, Wyatt said. He was already at the door. Silas had come in from the second cabin 2 hours before because the wind was wrong for Wyatt. He had been asleep in the chair by the door. He was on his feet now and reaching for his coat. Barn, Caleb said. The roof line. The three of them were out the door inside of 2 minutes. Elizabeth stood at the window with the curtain pulled back. The wind blew the snow sideways across the dooryard in long, low ribbons. The lantern light from the barn appeared and disappeared as the snow drove between the cabin and the door. She could hear the horses. She could hear Daisy. She could hear faintly the deep voice of one of the brothers shouting something into the wind. The woodbox by the stove was almost empty. She thought about it for 1 second. Then she went into the west room and pulled on the wool stockings and the heavy boots Silas had left at her door in November, and she put on the buffalo hide coat that hung by the door, the coat that belonged to Silas and that hung on her like a tent, and she lit the second lantern with a hand that did not shake as much as she had expected, and she went out into the storm. The cold took her breath away the moment she stepped off the porch. It was not the kind of cold a Boston winter had taught her. It was a cold with edges. It cut through the buffalo hide where the buttons had not closed all the way. She lowered her head and walked the trench Caleb had dug to the barn. The trench was filling. The wind had pushed 2 feet of fresh snow into it in the last hour. She waited. When she came up to the barn door, she saw it. A tree, an old white pine 70 feet tall, had come down across the southwest corner of the barn roof. It had not gone through the slate, but it had cracked the main ridge beam. The roof was sagging on that corner slowly, and the horses inside, sensing it, were screaming. The cow was throwing herself against her stall. If the corner went, it would go on top of the rear 2 stalls, and Murdoch and Job were in those stalls. Caleb was at the corner under the cracking beam. He had his shoulder under the longest cross beam, and he was holding it up. He was holding it up with his back. His face was the color of paper. His boots were sliding in the wet straw. Wyatt was working the bolt on Murdoch's stall door. The horse was rearing. Wyatt was talking to him in a low, even voice, the voice of a man who had once led the same horse out of a far worse place, the voice of a man who had been to the wilderness. Silas was outside the barn on the snowdrift side, climbing up onto the roof with an axe. Elizabeth saw all of it inside of 3 seconds. Then she saw past Caleb on a peg on the barn wall, the long iron pry bar Caleb used to set the heavy beams when he was building anything. It was 4 feet long and it weighed perhaps 30 pounds. She crossed the barn through the kicking horses to the wall and took the pry bar off the peg, and she walked it back across the barn to Caleb under the cracking beam, and she set the bar at his feet. "Brace it," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Use the post for a fulcrum. I will hold the lantern." Caleb's eyes flicked sideways at her. He did not waste the breath to argue. He kicked the lower end of the bar against the foot of the heavy oak post that held up the loft. He set the upper end of the bar under the cracked beam where his shoulder was. He let his weight off his shoulder onto the bar, slow, and the bar took the weight and held. And Caleb stepped out from under and stood up straight, and his breath came out of him in a long white cloud. She held the lantern high. Wyatt got Murdoch out of the stall and into the front of the barn. He came back for Job. He got Job out. He went for the cow. The cow was the easiest. The cow only wanted out. Above them on the roof, Silas's axe was working at the trunk of the pine where it lay across the cracked beam. The blade rang on the wood slow and steady, the way Caleb's hammer rang on iron. Snow showered down inside the barn with every stroke. Elizabeth held the lantern with both hands and kept it high, and the light kept the bar visible, and the bar kept the beam up, and the beam kept the roof. It took Silas 11 minutes to cut through the trunk. When the trunk parted, the upper portion of the pine slid sideways off the roof and crashed down into the snowdrift beside the barn, and the weight on the cracked beam halved, and the beam stopped sagging, and Caleb let out a sound that was almost a laugh. They closed the horses into the front stalls. They braced the cracked beam with 2 more posts they hammered up under it from below. They wrapped Daisy in a blanket and led her into the front of the barn beside the horses. By the time they walked back to the cabin through the trench, the storm had begun to ease, and the eastern sky was the kind of black that means dawn is 2 hours off and not yet. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth set the lantern on the table. Her hands were shaking now. The cold was past and the fear had finally caught her up. She put the kettle on. She made coffee. She made it strong and black, and she set 4 tin cups on the table and she filled them. The 4 of them sat at the table. None of them spoke. They drank the coffee. Silas's hands were red and raw from the axe and from the cold. He held the cup in both of them and warmed his face in the steam. Wyatt's coat was open at the collar, and he was breathing slow and deep, the way a man breathes coming down off a long fight. Caleb sat with his hands flat on the table on either side of his cup, the way he had sat the morning he laid out the terms. It was Silas who spoke first. "You should not have come out," he said, quietly, to Elizabeth. "I am part of this household," she said. "Or I am not." He looked up at her. He did not answer for a long second. Then he said, "You are." That was all. But Caleb, across the table in the lamplight, looked at her in a way she had not been looked at by any man in 22 years of life. He did not look at her with hunger. He did not look at her the way Charles Whitmore had looked at her in the breakfast room. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has just understood was not what he thought it was, and was in fact much more. He held the look for 3 seconds. Then he lowered his eyes to the coffee. "Bed," he said quietly. "All of us. It is past 4. Stock at first light." She stood up to go. At the door of the west room she stopped. She looked back. Caleb was still sitting at the table. He had not moved. The lamp threw the shadow of his shoulders onto the wall behind him, and the shadow was the size of a doorway. "Good night, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Good night, Miss Hartwell," he said. She went into the west room and she shut the door. She did not slide the bolt. She had not slid the bolt for 2 weeks. It was 8 days after the storm, on a moonless night near the end of February, that she heard the conversation she was never meant to hear. She had gone out to the privy. The night was clear, and the stars were the cold, hard stars of the high country in February. The path was packed down hard underfoot. Coming back, she paused at the corner of the cabin to look at the stars, and the wind brought her very faint the sound of voices from the side of the small east cabin where Wyatt and Silas slept. The voices were low. They were brothers' voices. She did not mean to listen. She would tell herself later that she did not mean to, but her feet did not move. "You love her too," Wyatt said. "Brother," a long silence. "I do," Silas said. Another silence. Longer. "I have known since November," Wyatt said. "The afternoon you stood up from the cow's head in the barn and would not look at her. I have known since then." "It does not matter," Silas said. His voice was the voice she had heard in the barn, the slow voice he used with frightened animals. "It does not matter, Wyatt. She chose Caleb. She chose him before she even knew his face. She wrote the letter to him. She came west to him. She did not come west to me. She did not come west to you. We are not going to take a thing from him. I was not asking us to take a thing. I know you were not." "Caleb deserves it," Silas said. After a moment, after our father, after all of it, He has been the one carrying us for 10 years. He has not had a Sunday to himself in 10 years. If any of the three of us deserves this, it is him. I know, Wyatt said. So we say nothing, Silas said, ever, to anyone. We are her brothers. We are uncles to whatever children come into this cabin. We die before we let a man down in Willow Creek lay a hand on her or on Caleb. That is the bargain. That is the price. That is the price, Wyatt said. Brother, I swear it on Hannah's grave, Silas said. And on Mother's, Wyatt said. There was a long silence after that. After a while, Elizabeth heard one of them. She did not know which draw in a long, slow breath that was almost but not quite a sea, and after that, nothing for a count of 20. And then the soft creak of the door of the small east cabin opening and closing, and the click of a lamp being turned down. She stood at the corner of the main cabin in the cold for a full minute longer. She pressed her hand flat against the rough log wall. She did not cry. She thought instead of the small carved comb on the table that first morning, and the bouquet of dried columbine, and the moccasins. The comb had been Caleb's. She had known that since the third day by the cut of the letters. The columbine. She had wondered sometimes who had picked them. They had been picked in late summer and dried and saved through autumn for a woman who was not yet in the cabin, picked by a man who did not yet know her name. The moccasins, the careful sinew stitching, the exact size. She had never asked. Now she knew. She walked very slowly around the corner of the cabin and up onto the porch. She let herself in quietly. Caleb was at the rocker by the fire as he was on every Wyatt night. He did not turn his head as she came in. He was a man who knew even with his eyes on the fire who was in the room with him. Cold out, he said. Cold, she agreed. She crossed the room and stopped at his chair. She did not sit down. She put her hand on the back of his shoulder. Just rested it there. The wool of his shirt was warm. He did not move. A minute passed. He set his Bible down on the small table at his elbow. He covered her hand with his own. His hand was huge and warm, and the calluses were a comfort against her cold fingers. He did not look up at her face. You all right, he said. I am all right. She stood there with her hand under his hand on his shoulder for another minute, and then she turned and went to the west room and shut the door. And this time she did slide to the bolt, but she slid it only because she did not trust herself. And she lay in the bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling logs, and she thought, I will be the best wife to that man that any woman has ever been. I will be the best sister to those two that any woman has ever been. I will not break what those three have built. I will join it. I will hold it. I will pour what I have into it the way a woman pours fresh water into a cistern that has gone half dry. She slept then. She slept the way she had not slept since the morning she walked out of the Whitmore house in Boston with $11.47 to her name. The first week of March came in warm. The icicles along the eaves of the cabin began to drip in the afternoons. The aspens at the edge of the meadow showed the first pale green at their tips. The wind out of the south, which had been the wind of the burn back in September, came back over the ridge with a smell of wet earth and pine sap in it that was the smell of a country waking up. On the third afternoon, Elizabeth walked out onto the porch and stood with her face into the southern wind and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 months she felt the sun on her eyelids, and she thought, we made it. We made it through. It was Wyatt who came back from the morning circuit on the fourth day with the news. He had ridden out to check the snares on the North Fork and to look at the state of the pass. He came back on Arrow at a fast trot with his rifle across his thigh. He swung down at the porch and he did not bother to tie the buckskin because the buckskin would not move when he did not want it to. He came up the steps 2 at a time, and he stopped at the door and looked at the 3 of them sitting around the kitchen table over breakfast, and he laid the rifle flat on the table. 4 riders, he said, 5 miles down the south trail. Coming up. The room went very still. How many of them did you see? Caleb said. I saw 4. 4 horses. One of them is a black Mustang. It has cedar burr on its fetlocks. He is one of them. Silas had set his cup down when he said, 2 hours maybe. The lower pass is open enough at the north chute for a horse if a man walks it part of the way. They are walking the part where they have to. They are coming. Caleb looked across the table at Elizabeth. It is time, he said, quietly. She nodded. It is time, she said. The plan had been laid out twice through the long winter on 2 different evenings at the same table. They did not need to lay it out a third time. They knew the parts they had to play. Silas to the barn, saddle 4 horses, ammunition for the rifles 20 rounds each. The double bag of dried meat and the small bag of cornmeal Elizabeth had set aside 3 weeks back. 2 wool blankets per saddle. The compass. Wyatt to the small east cabin, to gather the documents. The deed to the homestead which their father had filed in 1869. The receipts for taxes paid for 10 consecutive years, which Caleb had kept in a tin box. The copy of the engineer's report Wyatt had paid the Willow Creek clerk $3 to make for him in November. The letter from Mary Patterson at the Willow Creek General Store, which Wyatt had also brought home that fall, sealed and unread, addressed to Elizabeth. Caleb to the smithy, to bank the forge fire so that it would not die in their absence, and so that it would not catch the smithy on fire either. To pull 2 hammers and a chisel from the rack. To do one other thing that he did not say out loud. Elizabeth to the cabin, to dress for hard riding, to take her mother's Bible and the small bundle of clothes she had brought from Boston, which had been mended through the winter, into something nearly new. To take the deed paper she would sign if it ever came to that, the paper that named her witness to all the things Wyatt had laid out at the table 4 months earlier. They moved fast. They did not waste a word. Inside of 40 minutes, the 4 horses were saddled in the dooryard. Elizabeth stood at the porch in a heavy wool riding skirt and one of Caleb's old shirts taken in at the shoulders, with her hair plaited down her back, and the brooch that had been her mother's pinned at her collar. The brooch had been straightened and repolished. Caleb had done it on a Sunday in January at the small bench in the smithy, working the warped silver back into its proper shape with a tiny ball peen hammer no bigger than his thumb. He had not told her he was going to do it. She had come into the smithy to bring him coffee and had found him bent over the brooch with a jeweler's loop to his eye, his enormous shoulders held still as a watchmaker's, and she had gone back to the cabin without disturbing him, and 3 days later the brooch had appeared on the table outside her door alongside a fresh small pile of dried columbine. It was not perfect. The face on the cameo still listed slightly to one side the way a stroke survivor's face does. Caleb had said when she asked him about it later, "I could not get her quite right, miss. Some things the fire takes are not all the way given back. But she stands up now. She does not lie down. She wore it now. She would wear it the rest of her life." Silas had brought the 4 horses around. Caleb came up from the smithy with his canvas pack and a long bundle wrapped in oilcloth that he tied behind his saddle with a quick double knot, and he did not say what was in it, and no one asked. Wyatt came up from the small east cabin with the tin document box under his arm. He glanced once at the southern trail. 3 miles, he said. Maybe less. Then we ride, Caleb said. Caleb walked over to Elizabeth at the porch. He stopped 1 pace from her. He took her bandaged hands in his, the bandages long since gone, the skin of her palms healed, but still pink, and he looked down into her face the way he had looked down into her face the morning she had walked out of the burn into his life. "We are going east," he said, "across the upper meadow, down the back side of the ridge, by the old hunting trail my father showed us when we were boys. Not down the south trail, not down the road. They will not see us. We will be in Boise the night after tomorrow. We will be in the federal marshal's office the morning after that." She nodded. "Whatever happens between here and Boise," he said. "Whatever happens. You are home, Miss Hartwell. You hear me. You are home now." She lifted up onto the toes of her boots and pressed her forehead to his chest for 1 second only, and she said into the wool of his coat very quietly, "A Hartwell keeps her word, Mr. Calloway." Then they mounted. Caleb on Murdoch, Wyatt on Arrow, Silas on Job, Elizabeth on the small, dependable mule Barnaby, whose gait was the gentlest of any animal on the mountain and whose nerves were the steadiest. They rode east across the upper meadow with the morning sun at their backs and the long blue wall of the Sawtooth Range opening ahead of them, and far below them on the south trail, four small black dots were just coming around the last bend before the cabin, and the four dots had no idea yet that the cabin they were riding toward had already been emptied of every soul they had come to find. Caleb led. Wyatt rode rear guard. Silas kept Elizabeth between them. They climbed the back of the ridge at a steady walk for 2 hours, and, at the lone pine on the eastern crest where his father and his mother lay buried under a slab of granite, he had cut and lettered with his own hands 11 years before. Caleb stopped his horse, and the others stopped behind him, and he sat the saddle without dismounting, and he laid his right hand flat on his own chest over his heart, and he said into the wind in the voice of a son, "We are going down to Boise, Mother, to bring the law on the man who would take this from us. Watch over us until we come back. Watch over the girl. She is one of ours now." He did not wait for an answer. He never did. He turned his horse and led them down the back side of the mountain toward the long, thin line of the Boise Road, and the wind out of the south rose and met them as they descended, and somewhere 10 miles ahead in a town they were not yet in, a man with gray hairs cut like a sickle was finishing his morning coffee in a private dining room in the Willow Creek Hotel, and somewhere 4 miles behind them, four men on tired horses were arriving at an empty cabin to find the forge banked. The cabin door bolted from the outside, and a single sheet of paper nailed to the inside of the barn door, written in the careful, slanted hand of a Boston governess, and the paper said simply, "Mr. Morgan, we have gone to Boise. Tell Mr. Blackwood we will see him in court. Elizabeth Hartwell." They camped the first night in a stand of lodgepole pine 10 miles east of the Lone Pine Ridge on the bank of a fast, cold creek that ran down off the north shoulder of the mountain and was choked at the edges with the last black ice of the winter. They built a small fire that threw no smoke. They ate dried beef and cornmeal porridge cooked in a tin pan over coals. The horses they tied on a rope line between two trees and watered at the creek and gave each one a half scoop of grain from the saddlebag. They slept in shifts. Wyatt took the first watch. Silas took the second. Caleb took the dawn. At some time past midnight, when the fire had burned down to a low red bed, and Wyatt was the only one awake, he came over to where Caleb lay rolled in his blanket beside the fire and squatted down on his heels and shook his brother awake. He did it gently. He did not speak. Caleb opened his eyes. A little way off, Wyatt said very quietly. The two men walked 30 yards into the trees away from the fire and the sleeping forms of Elizabeth and Silas. Wyatt stopped and looked up at the black sky and the cold stars in it. "You ought to give it to her tonight," Wyatt said. "What?" "What you have wrapped in oilcloth on Murdoch's saddle." Caleb said nothing. "Brother," Wyatt said, "tomorrow could be a hard day. The day after could be harder. If something goes wrong on Hawks Pass, you do not want her riding into Boise without it. You give it to her tonight, by the fire, while she still has hands to take it in." Caleb stood for a long time with his arms folded and his chin against his collar. Then he nodded once very slowly. "You are not the fool, brother," he said. "I am." Wyatt almost smiled. He laid his hand on Caleb's shoulder for 1 second, the way Silas had laid his hand on Caleb's shoulder the afternoon of the fire, and then he walked back to the fire and stretched out on his blanket and pulled his hat down over his eyes. Caleb went to Murdoch and untied the long oilcloth bundle and walked back with it to the fire. Elizabeth was not asleep. She had been lying on her back inside the blankets watching the stars between the branches of the pines, and she sat up when she saw him come by the firelight on the side of his face, the bundle under his arm. He sat down on the log opposite her across the low fire. He laid the bundle across his knees and unwrapped it slowly. The oilcloth came open, and inside it, lying on a fold of clean wool, was a rose forged from black iron. The stem was the length of a forearm and turned with a slow, easy twist that mimicked a real growing thing. There were 3 small leaves along the stem, hammered so thin at the edges They almost flexed under the firelight, each leaf veined with the careful tip of a chisel he had used like a brush. The bud at the top was full open, 12 petals, each one drawn out and curled and laid against the next the way real petals layer against one another in a real bloom. The whole thing had been polished to the deep blue-black of a kettle that had been on the stove for 30 years, and there was a thin sheen of beeswax across it that had been worked in warm and would protect it through any weather a country could throw at iron. Elizabeth did not speak. Caleb did not look up from it. "I started this in December," he said, "the night you taught Wyatt the letter G. I went out to the smithy after you all had gone to bed, and I worked on it for 2 hours, and I worked on it for 2 hours every night. You were not in the smithy with me, and I finished it in the third week of February, the night before the storm took the barn roof." Wyatt and Silas have known the whole time. They never said a word. He turned the rose in his hands. "Iron does not bloom," he said. "It is one of the laws of the country we live in. Iron is shaped by the hammer and the heat and the patience of a man who is willing to be quiet for as long as the work takes. Iron is shaped, and iron holds the shape that is given to it, and iron does not by its own nature grow." He looked up at her at last across the fire. "But I wanted it to bloom for you, miss," he said. "I wanted there to be a thing on this earth that the rules said could not exist, and have it exist anyway, because you walked out of the burn and into our cabin, and into the place in my chest that I had walled up the morning I buried my mother. I wanted the iron in this country to do for you what I have not been brave enough to say in plain words. So I am going to say the words now before tomorrow while there is time." He did not move from the log. He did not come around the fire. He kept his distance the way he had always kept his distance, with her on her terms and her time. "I love you, Elizabeth Hartwell," he said. "I have loved you since the morning I lifted you off the ash by the dead pine, and you weighed less than the iron on my anvil. I do not know what tomorrow holds. I do not know what Hawks Pass holds. I do not know if we will all four of us ride out the backside of these mountains together. But I am asking you tonight in the only way I know how. Take this rose. And if we ride into Boise alive, marry me when we ride out. Be a Calloway." She crossed the fire. She was not careful where she put her feet. She walked through the embers at the edge, and her boots scattered them, and she did not slow down. She came around the log, and she sat down on the ground in front of him, and she held out her hands. He laid the iron rose into them. It was heavier than it looked. The petals warmed almost at once against the skin of her palms. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Caleb Calloway, I will be a Calloway." He did not move. He sat with his hands open on his knees, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw water at the corner of his eye, just a single bead caught in the line of his lower lash that did not fall and that he did not wipe. She rose up onto her knees in front of him and laid the iron rose on the log beside him and put her hands on either side of his bearded face. She drew him down. She kissed him once on the mouth, slow and careful, the first true kiss of her life. Across the fire, Wyatt did not lift his hat. A few feet to his left, Silas, who had been awake the whole time and had given them privacy by not moving, drew in a long, slow breath and let it out, and a tear ran down the side of his face into the wool blanket under his ear, and he did not wipe it either. The fire popped. The night went on. In the morning, they broke camp before the sun came up, and they rode east toward Hawks Pass with the iron rose wrapped in clean linen inside Elizabeth's saddlebag against her thigh. Hawks Pass was a notch in the eastern shoulder of the Sawtooth Range, half a mile of narrow trail between two granite walls. The trail no wider in places than the width of a single horse, with a long fall on the south side into a stand of dead timber 100 feet below. It was the kind of place a man who knew the country could hold against an army. It was also the kind of place a man who knew the country, if he was the wrong kind of man, could choose for a killing. They came up to the western mouth of the pass at 10:30 in the morning. Wyatt rode point. He had been reading the trail since dawn. He had said nothing for the last hour. 20 yards short of the mouth, he raised his fist and stopped his horse. Caleb pulled up. Silas pulled up. Elizabeth on Barnaby pulled up between them. Tracks, Wyatt said, quietly, without turning his head. Where Caleb said, through. They came through last night. 4 horses, 1 Mustang. They came through and turned south. They did not come back out. Silas had already swung down off Job. He was checking the loads in his rifle. They are above us, Silas said. He is above us. Caleb did not need it explained. He had spent his whole life on this mountain. He knew Hawks Pass the way another man knew his own dooryard. There was a small ledge, a kind of natural blind, on the north wall of the pass. About a third of the way through that, a man with a rifle could lie on flat and look down on the trail and not be seen from below until he chose to be. The 4 riders had come through the pass last night, turned off the trail at the eastern end, climbed the back of the north wall, and worked their way west along the spine to the ledge. They had spent the night up there. They were up there now. Caleb looked at Elizabeth. You stay here, he said. You hold the horses. You do not move. I am coming, she said. Her voice was the voice she had used in the breakfast room of Mildred Whitmore. Miss Hartwell, Caleb, she said his given name for the first time. If you go into that pass without me, and you do not come out, what good is my surviving to ride into Boise alone and tell a marshal what no one is left to corroborate? I am the witness. I am why we are here. I am coming. The 3 brothers looked at each other. Wyatt nodded once. She is right, brother. Silas nodded once. She is right. Caleb closed his eyes for 1 second only. When he opened them, he was the eldest brother again. All right, he said, listen to me. We do not ride through. We climb the south wall. The south wall is a longer climb, but it puts us above their ledge. We come down on them from the rear. Wyatt, you take the rifle and find a perch. Silas, you take the close work. I take the middle. Miss Hartwell, Elizabeth, you stay behind Silas at all times. You have the Bowie knife Wyatt gave you in your boot. You do not draw it unless a man comes inside 3 feet of you. You hear me? I hear you. They tied the horses in a stand of stunted juniper. They climbed the south wall on foot. It took them almost an hour. Silas went first, the largest of them, finding the holds, his boots silent on the rock. Wyatt went second, the rifle slung. Elizabeth went third with Caleb at her back, his hand twice on the small of her back to steady her over a hard step, his hand never lingering. At the top of the south wall, they crawled forward on their bellies through a thin stand of mountain mahogany and looked across the pass to the north wall. 4 men. 3 of them were lying flat behind the boulders along the lip of the ledge, rifles trained west on the trail mouth. They were waiting for 4 riders to come through. They were facing the wrong way. The 4th was a little behind the others, standing up against the rock face, smoking a cigar. The cigar smoke drifted east on the morning wind. The man's right cheek, even from this distance, even through the mountain mahogany, showed the long sickle scar that ran from the corner of his eye to the edge of his jaw. Wyatt, Caleb said. Wyatt did not answer. He was sliding the Henderson rifle forward through the brush and settling the stock against his shoulder. He was sighting on the first of the 3 men at the lip. The shot was a long one, 200 yards slightly downhill with a quartering breeze. Wyatt took his time. He had read the wind for the last 10 minutes the way another man reads a book. He let his breath out halfway and held it. He squeezed the trigger. The Henderson rifle cracked. The first man at the lip jerked once hard and rolled sideways off the edge of the ledge and was gone over the long fall 100 feet down, and the sound of his body in the dead timber below came up to them a second and a half later as a single dry crack. The other 3 men on the ledge spun around. They had no cover from the south. They had built their blind for an attack from the west. They had not believed any man could come around behind them on Hawks Pass. Wyatt worked the lever of the Henderson rifle and shot the second man at the lip through the shoulder before the man's rifle was off the ground. The man went down on one knee. Wyatt worked the lever and shot him a second time in the center of the chest, and the man went over backward and lay still. The third man at the lip threw down his rifle and put his hands in the air. He was a young man no more than 22, With a thin face, he was crying. He kept saying, "I did not know. Mister, I did not know what was up there until this morning, I swear on my mother." The fourth man, the man with the sickle scar, threw away his cigar and dove for the rock face. There was a cleft in the stone behind him, a narrow chimney that climbed maybe 10 feet to a broken shelf. Jeb Morgan went up it like a goat. He had done this before. He came up onto the shelf and he threw himself flat, and from the angle of the south wall, Wyatt could no longer get a clean shot on him. Caleb Silas said, "He is going for the backside of the ridge. He will come around behind you." "I see him," Caleb said. "Cover the boy on the ledge. Do not let him pick that rifle back up." Caleb stood up. He drew the long Colt revolver from the holster on his right hip. He left the cover of the mountain mahogany and ran east along the spine of the south wall, parallel to the spine of the north wall, the two ridges separated by the long cut of the pass. He could see Jeb Morgan on the shelf above the ledge, stomach down, scrambling east toward the back of the north ridge, where there was a slope a man could go down on. Caleb ran. He was 34 years old and he was carrying 24 extra pounds of hammer muscle on his shoulders. And he ran like a man 20 years younger because what was at his back was Elizabeth. He did not see the trap. Jeb Morgan was not running for the back slope. Jeb Morgan, who had 11 killings on his ledger between Texas and Idaho, had crossed Hawks Pass 3 times in the past 6 months scouting it. Jeb Morgan knew there was a small notch at the back of the North Ridge where a man could double back along a hidden game trail and come up on the South Ridge behind anyone foolish enough to chase him. Caleb ran east along the south spine, his eyes locked on the moving figure across the pass. Behind him, almost silent, a second man was coming up out of a fold in the rock he had been lying in for 40 seconds. He had come up the south wall 100 yards behind them. He had been lying flat in a juniper bowl while Wyatt was sighting his rifle. He was 28 years old, his name was Coker, and he had ridden with Jeb Morgan out of El Paso for 2 years, and he carried a long Bowie knife strapped behind his back that had killed 4 men. He came up out of the juniper bowl behind Caleb at a dead run. Elizabeth saw him. She had been crouched behind Silas the whole time where Caleb had told her to be. When Caleb stood up and ran east, her eyes had stayed on him because her eyes had stayed on him for 4 months. She had seen the small shadow break out of the juniper bowl behind Caleb, and she had seen the long blade come out from behind the man's back. And she had understood in the same single second 3 things. Caleb did not see him. Silas had Wyatt pinned watching the boy on the ledge. She was the only one who could close the distance. She ran. She did not draw the Bowie knife from her boot. She did not have time. She crossed 20 yards of broken rock in the space of 5 heartbeats, with her skirt gathered in her left hand and her right hand already reaching, and the man named Coker heard her coming and started to turn, and that was the second she needed, and she went into him low at the shoulder the way her father had once shown her. A bricklayer goes into a fallen wall, and he was bigger than she was, but she had momentum and she had surprise, and she drove him sideways off the crest of the south spine and over the long fall into the dead timber 100 feet below. She almost went with him. Her left hand caught a thick juniper root at the lip of the drop. The juniper root held. Coker did not. He went down with his arms open and his long blade flashing and made no sound at all on the way down. And she heard him hit the dead timber below, the way she had heard the first man hit. And then there was only the wind and her hand on the juniper root and her breath sawing out of her ribs. A huge hand closed around her wrist. Silas had her. He pulled her up onto the spine in one easy lift, the way he would have lifted a calf out of a creek. He set her on her feet. He did not let go of her wrist for 3 seconds. He looked into her face. His eyes were the color of cold whiskey, and they were very wet. "You are not the Boston girl anymore," he said quietly. "I am Elizabeth Calloway," she said. He nodded. "You are." Across the pass, Caleb had stopped his run because he had heard the shout Wyatt had thrown after him, and he had turned, and he had seen the whole thing, and he was coming back along the south spine at a dead run. Jeb Morgan had reached the back slope of the North Ridge, and was sliding down it on the seat of his pants in a small avalanche of loose rock, the way a man slides down a bank when he has stopped caring about dignity. He hit the bottom of the slope. He came up on his feet. He ran east toward where they had tied the horses. Wyatt stood up out of the mountain mahogany and lifted the Henderson rifle and tracked him. The shot was 300 yards. It was the longest shot Wyatt had ever taken in his life. The Henderson cracked. Jeb Morgan went down on his face in the gravel beside the trail, and he did not get up. The sound of the shot rolled back and forth between the granite walls of Hawks Pass for what felt like a long time. Then there was only the wind. Caleb reached Elizabeth on the south spine and took her by both shoulders and turned her toward him and looked her up and down once and saw she was whole, and then he pulled her against his chest and he held her there for a count of 10, and he did not say a word. Silas climbed down to the man named Coker in the dead timber and confirmed he was dead. He came back up. Wyatt walked across the pass and kept the boy on the ledge under the rifle and tied his hands with a length of leather strap and walked him down off the ledge by the backside of the north ridge. They found Jeb Morgan in the gravel where he had fallen. He was alive. The Henderson round had gone through his right shoulder and broken the bone and shattered the shoulder blade. He was bleeding. He was conscious. He looked up at Caleb out of pale eyes and tried to smile with one corner of his mouth. "Calloway," he said. Caleb said nothing. "He was going to pay you," Jeff said. "After. He was going to pay you for the trouble. That was always the plan. That was always the deal. Tell the Marshal Calloway. Tell him I was the one who pulled the trigger on Jacobson and Decker. Tell him I will name the mayor in court. You let me ride. You let me ride out of this country, and I will give you the man who made the plan." Caleb crouched down beside him. "You will ride into Boise with us," he said quietly, "in the back of a wagon, with your hands tied. You will tell the federal marshal what you just told me, and then you will rot in the Idaho Territorial Prison for the rest of your natural life, because I am not the kind of man who lets a sickle scar walk out of these mountains." Jeb's head turned away on the gravel. Caleb stood up. "Bind him," he said to Silas. "Bind him hard." They camped that night 10 miles east of Hawks Pass in an aspen grove at the head of a small green valley that opened toward the Boise Road. They bound Jeb Morgan and the boy to a single small pine and gagged Jeb because his mouth would not stop, and they fed the boy cornmeal porridge with their own hands because his hands were tied and his mother somewhere in Missouri had not raised him for this. They built a small fire and they sat around it, and none of them spoke for a long time. Elizabeth sat between Caleb and Silas with the iron rose in her lap. Across the fire, Wyatt sat alone with the Henderson rifle laid across his knees and his eyes on the dark, the way a man sits who has just made a 300-yard shot at a moving target with a woman he loves at his back, and who is glad he was the one who could do it, and who is also glad it is finished. After a long while, Caleb laid his hand over Elizabeth's hand on the iron rose. "When we ride into Boise tomorrow," he said quietly, "I am going to ask the marshal for a preacher first and a judge second." She turned her hand under his and laced her fingers through his. "Yes, Mr. Calloway," she said. The federal marshal in Boise was a 50-year-old man named Wesley Hayes, who had served 3 years in the Union Army and 20 in territorial law enforcement, and who had a face like a piece of iron that had been hammered cold for too long. He listened to Elizabeth Hartwell tell her story in a small, wood-paneled office on the second floor of the Boise courthouse for 3 hours and 20 minutes without once interrupting her. He took notes on a yellow pad with a steel nib pen. He asked her 4 questions in 3 hours. They were good questions. She answered all of them. When she was done, he looked at the 3 Calloway brothers who had sat against the wall in a row of 3 wooden chairs with their hats on their knees the entire time, and he looked back at her. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Yes, sir. I have been a federal marshal for 9 years. I have heard a great many stories in this office. I want you to know that I believe every word you have just told me." She did not cry. She had been ready to cry. She did not. "Thank you, sir," she said. He turned to the brothers. "You men ride back to your cabin and you stay there. I will send a deputy with a wagon for the prisoners within the hour. I will send a 6-man company of marshals to Willow Creek tomorrow morning at first light. By Tuesday night, Roland Blackwood will be in irons in the Boise jail, and by Friday, his bank accounts will be frozen by federal order pending trial. He is finished. He looked at Caleb a long second. Mr. Calloway, are you the eldest? I am, sir. By 14 minutes. Marshal Hayes almost smiled. Almost. I am told by Miss Hartwell. He said that you and she intend to be married before you ride back up that mountain. That is correct, sir. There is a Methodist church on Main Street, he said. The preacher is a man named Hollander. He is a friend of mine. If you tell him I sent you, he will marry you this afternoon. I will sign as your witness when you bring the certificate back here for filing. Caleb stood up. He held out his hand. Marshal Hayes shook it once hard. Welcome to Idaho, Mrs. Calloway, the marshal said. It was a small wedding. They were married in the front room of the Methodist parsonage on Main Street in Boise on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, with the windows open to a warm wind and a single yellow daffodil in a glass jar on the parlor table. The preacher Hollander was a soft-spoken Pennsylvania Quaker with white hair and warm hands. He read the vows from a small leather book. He did not hurry. Wyatt stood up with Caleb as the witness for the groom. Silas stood up with Elizabeth as the witness for the bride. Marshal Wesley Hayes sat in a chair against the back wall with his hat on his knees. When the preacher Hollander asked her in the old language of the rite whether she would have this man, Elizabeth Hartwell, who had walked out of the Whitmore house in Boston 7 months ago, with $11.47 to her name, looked up into the dark whiskey eyes of the largest man she had ever known, and said very clearly in the voice of a Calloway, I will. She wore the iron rose pinned at her shoulder. The cameo brooch of her mother was at her throat. The kiss at the end of the rite was brief and proper in the way of a Methodist parsonage. The preacher Hollander shook Caleb's hand. Marshal Hayes signed the certificate as the second witness. The four of them walked out into the spring sunshine of Boise, Idaho territory, with the certificate folded in the pocket of Caleb's coat, and the long road home ahead of them, and behind them, in a stone-walled cell in the basement of the Boise jail, a man named Roland Blackwood was already on his way down from the Willow Creek Hotel under an armed escort he had not seen coming. He was sentenced 6 weeks later to 25 years of hard labor at the Idaho Territorial Prison for criminal conspiracy, attempted murder fraud, and the murder of 2 homesteaders by his agents. He served 18 of the 25 years before he died of a stroke in the prison infirmary in 1898. The land he had stolen from the widows Jacobson and Decker was returned by federal court order to the heirs the marshals could find. Jeb Morgan, who turned state's evidence as he had promised, was sentenced to life without parole in the same prison. He was killed in a yard fight in 1885 by a man whose brother he had murdered in Texas in 1873. The boy on the ledge, whose name turned out to be Will Henley, was sentenced to 4 years for accessory and was paroled after 2 for good behavior. He went home to his mother in Missouri and was never heard of again in Idaho. These were the small, later facts. They mattered, but they were not the story. The story, the part that was worth telling on a porch on a cold autumn evening many years from then, was what came after. They rode back up to Sawtooth Ridge in the second week of April. The aspens at the edge of the upper meadow were full pale green. The chickadees had come back. The cabin stood as they had left it, the door bolted from the outside, the forge bank, the iron pry bar still leaning against the post in the barn where Elizabeth had set it on the night of the storm. Caleb broke the bolt off the cabin door and carried Elizabeth across the threshold. The years that followed came on like the slow, even strokes of a hammer at the right temperature. In the autumn of 1880, Wyatt and Silas built a new wing on the west side of the cabin, a proper bedroom with 2 windows and a stone fireplace of its own, so that Caleb and Elizabeth would have a room that was theirs. The 2 younger brothers built it in 6 weeks of fall evenings, and they refused to let Caleb help with anything but the chimney work. Samuel Joshua Calloway was born in the new room on a cold blue morning in January of 1881. He weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. Caleb, who had stood beside the bed of dying men in the wilderness without flinching, who had pulled iron at white heat from the forge with his bare hands, when he had to sat on the edge of the new bed and held his son and shook the way a man shakes when his life has just become much larger than he had ever imagined it could be. Wyatt and Silas stood in the doorway with their hats in their hands. Wyatt was crying. Silas was not, but only because he was holding it in for Wyatt's sake. In the spring of 1883, Wyatt rode down to Willow Creek to buy a wool coat and met a young Irish widow named Margaret Sullivan at the dry goods counter. She was 26 years old. She had a 5-year-old son named Patrick from a husband who had died of typhoid the year before. Wyatt courted her for 3 months slowly, the way he did everything, and they were married in October of that year by the same preacher Ainsworth, who had been the original preacher Caleb had named in his terms long ago. Margaret and Patrick moved up to Sawtooth Ridge into the small east cabin, which Wyatt had expanded and chinked tight against the winter, and Patrick learned to read the ground from his stepfather almost as fast as Wyatt had learned to read the page from Elizabeth. Rose Eleanor Calloway was born in May of 1884. They named her for the iron rose and for Caleb's mother. She had her mother's blue eyes and her father's whiskey-colored hair and a temperament like a sunlit creek. Silas was the first one to make her laugh. He spent 20 minutes a day standing on his head in the kitchen for the first 6 months of her life. Elizabeth never told him she could see him through the window every afternoon she was gathering eggs. Wyatt and Margaret had a daughter named Lily in 1884, the same year as Rose, and a son named Thomas in 1886, named for Thomas Patterson, who had perished in the wagon train fire and who had loved his wife. In 1887, on a bright April morning, Mary Patterson and her 8-year-old daughter Hope arrived at the gate of the Sawtooth Ridge homestead in a hired buggy from the railhead at Boise. They had come from Salem, Oregon 8 years after the fire. The reunion in the dooryard between Elizabeth Calloway and Mary Patterson was witnessed by every member of the household and by Hope Patterson, who would later in her life become a nurse at the Multnomah Hospital in Portland, and who had been told the story of the day of the fire her whole life, and who knew the woman in front of her, the woman holding her mother in the dirt in front of a log cabin in Idaho, was the woman her mother had wept for as a sister gone into the smoke. Hope held the iron rose in her hands that afternoon in the cabin and turned it slowly in the spring light and did not speak for a long time. Silas Calloway was the last of the 3 brothers to marry. He waited a long time. In 1894, at the age of 49, he met a Quaker widow named Sarah Whitfield, who had been born in Pennsylvania and who had come to Idaho in 1879 with a husband who had since died of a fall from a roof and who had been one of the women Roland Blackwood had once tried to cheat out of her parcel after her husband's death. Silas had met her once before at the wedding of Caleb and Elizabeth, when she had come up to Sawtooth Ridge to thank Elizabeth for the testimony that had broken Blackwood. She had remembered Silas. He had remembered her. 14 years had passed between the two memories. They were married in a Quaker meeting house in Boise in the autumn of 1894. The brief and quiet ceremony of the friends, and they came back to a small new cabin Silas had built half a mile east of the main homestead. A cabin with a south-facing porch and a tin roof, and a garden plot where Sarah grew lavender that did not, by all common reckoning, belong on a mountain in Idaho. In 1895, they had a daughter. They named her Grace Hannah Calloway because Sarah, who had heard the story, had insisted. Silas wept for an hour the night Grace was born. He did not try to hide it. The years passed. The blacksmith shop at Sawtooth Ridge became a name spoken with respect from Boise to Spokane. A Calloway plowshare lasted, men said, a year longer than any other share you could buy west of the Mississippi, and a Calloway hinge would outlast the door it was hung on. Henderson, the original customer, died in 1891 at the age of 84, and his sons kept buying their plowshares from the same shop, and so did their sons after them. Caleb taught Samuel everything he knew. Samuel was 9 years old when he forged his first plowshare alone, and 12 when his father told him with a look of straight-faced respect that the boy's hand on a hammer was as fair as any his father had ever seen, including his own. The mountain, which had been an iron one for $100,000 in the assayer's report, was never mined. The Callaway brothers turned down 3 offers from 3 different railroad companies between 1881 and 1893, and after that the offers stopped coming. The iron stayed in the ground. The mountain stayed a mountain. Wyatt taught his son Patrick and his nephew Samuel and his daughter Lily and his other son Thomas and every one of his grandchildren how to read the ground. The lessons happened on slow morning circuits through the timber and along the meadow edges. They began when each child was 6 years old. Wyatt was 72 when he gave the last of these lessons to a granddaughter named Eliza, and on that morning walking back to the cabin, his right hand resting on the small shoulder of the child, he said quietly the way he had said it to Elizabeth Hartwell in the autumn of 1879, "Mountain does not lie. Child people lie. Mountain does not." Silas grew old slowly. The fierce thing in him did not disappear eased. He sat on the porch of his cabin with Sarah on the long summer evenings, and he watched the light come down on the upper meadow, and he played simple chords on a small fiddle his daughter Grace had bought him for his 60th birthday. He never put the iron rose down. He had asked Caleb to make him a small one of his own, a smaller version, a single iron rose he kept on the mantel of his own cabin, and Caleb had made it for him in the winter of 1895, and Silas, who had once thrown a man through a plate glass window in Boise for putting his hand on a girl, looked at the small iron rose every morning of his life until the morning he died. He died first. It was a winter morning in February of 1908. He had walked out to the wood pile to bring in the morning load, and his heart had simply stopped the way the hearts of strong, quiet men sometimes stop, with no warning and no fuss, and he was found at the woodpile by Sarah. Half an hour later, the load of wood still neatly stacked in the crook of his arm, his face turned up to the pale February sky peaceful. He was 62. They buried him on the eastern ridge under the lone pine beside the grave of his father and his mother beside the grave that had been waiting for him for 39 years. Caleb stood at the grave and did not speak. Elizabeth stood beside him with her arm through his, and her hair was almost entirely silver now, and her face was the face of a woman who had been the steady center of a great unbroken household for a very long time. Wyatt read the 23rd Psalm. He read it without his finger on the line. He had not needed his finger on the line for 28 years. In the summer of 1909, on a Sunday in late August, the entire Callaway clan gathered at the main homestead for the supper they gathered at every Sunday in the summer. There were 22 of them now. They sat at a table Caleb had built 16 years before, 20 feet long, in the great room of the cabin he had finished in 1869. Beth, who had been called Beth by all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for almost 20 years, had baked 4 loaves of bread that morning. Margaret Pierce Samuel's wife had brought potatoes mashed with butter from her own kitchen. Sarah had made an apple pie. The cabin smelled of bread and roast beef and wood smoke, and the lavender Sarah had brought in fresh that morning from her garden. After supper, after the dishes were carried out to the kitchen, and the grandchildren had been turned loose into the dooryard to chase one another through the columbine, Caleb stood up at the head of the table. He was 64 years old. His beard was entirely white. His hands were the same hands they had always been scarred across the knuckles, the tip of the small finger missing on the left, the knuckles slightly knotted now with the work of a lifetime. He stood very straight. He had always stood very straight. The room went quiet. "Children," he said. 21 faces turned toward him. "Today is 30 years to the day," he said, "since your grandmother stepped down from a wagon into a valley that was about to be on fire. I want to tell you something about that day. Not because the day was important. Days happen. The day is not the thing. I want to tell you what the day taught me." He looked at Beth. She was looking up at him from her place at the foot of the table. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were the blue of cornflowers, and they were full of water that did not fall. He looked back at the children. "Iron is not destroyed by fire," he said quietly. "Iron is shaped by it. There is a difference. You will go through fire in your lives. You will lose people you love. You will be cheated by men you trusted. You will ride down into valleys where the smoke is so thick you cannot see your own hand. When that happens, I want you to remember, Iron is not destroyed by fire. Iron is shaped. He paused. And one more thing he said, the thing your great-grandmother said to me on her last day, and the thing I have tried to live by ever since. Do not let one another be alone in this world. Whatever else you do, whatever else this country asks of you, do not let one another be alone. He raised his coffee cup. To the Callaways, he said, to the next 90 years of them, 22 cups went up. To the Callaways, the room said. Later that evening, after the families had gone home to their own cabins down the slope, Caleb and Beth stood on the porch of the main cabin and watched the lights come on one by one in the 4 small homes their family had built on the backside of Sawtooth Ridge. Wyatt and Margaret's cabin, where 2 grandchildren had stayed the night. Sarah's cabin, where Grace, who was now 14, was reading aloud to her mother by the fire. Samuel and Margaret Pierce's cabin, where their 3 children were already asleep. Patrick Sullivan's cabin, the oldest of Wyatt's stepchildren, who was now 31 and married and had children of his own. Beth leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder. He covered her hand on the porch rail with his own. They did not speak for a long time. In the front room of the cabin behind them on the mantel above the great stone hearth, the iron rose sat in its place. It had been there for 29 years. It was still black. It was still polished. The wax on the petals had been refreshed by Caleb's own hand every May the 1st since 1880. Beth tilted her face up at last to her husband. She said very quietly, the way a woman says something she has been carrying with her whole life and has finally found the right evening to say it. That was the day my life began, she said. He bent and kissed her forehead. I know, he said. The wind came up out of the south, the way the wind had come up out of the south on the day she had walked down out of a wagon into the smoke. It carried the smell of pine sap and the sound of a child laughing somewhere down the slope. Winter somewhere was already coming. Winter always was, but not tonight. Tonight on a porch on the back of Sawtooth Ridge, in the great state of Idaho in the year of our Lord, 1909, an old blacksmith stood with his arm around an old woman from Boston who had once almost died in a valley of fire, and the two of them watched the lamps of their family come on against the deepening blue, and somewhere in the kitchen behind them, a kettle whistled, and somewhere in the eastern ridge above them, under a lone pine on a grave that had been there for 40 years, a stone marker carried the names of the man and woman who had begun this whole long story in a parlor in Pittsburgh in 1842. And the iron rose sat black and unchanged on the mantel inside, and the long winter was a memory now, a memory among many memories, a memory that had become in the way of memories that have been carried a long time and held with care, a kind of warmth. A Callaway man keeps his word, the wind said in the deep, slow voice of a husband, almost to itself. Mountain does not lie, the wind answered in the quiet voice of a brother. Winter always ends, the wind answered itself in the low, gentle voice of a youngest brother who had loved a woman without ever speaking the love, and had carried that silence to a grave under a lone pine. Iron is not destroyed by fire, the wind said. You are home now, the wind said. The lamps came on one after another in the cabins down the slope. The night came down soft over Sawtooth Ridge. And Beth Callaway, who had been Elizabeth Hartwell of Boston a long, long time ago, closed her eyes against the warm shoulder of the man she had married in a parsonage on Main Street in Boise 3 decades before, and she smiled the smile of a woman who has finally, fully, completely come home.